Good evening, my friend. Before we settle into tonight's long journey through history, take a moment to get comfortable. Perhaps you are listening from the United States, England, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else in the world where the night is growing quiet. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel across oceans and continents. If you enjoy slow, detailed history told in a calm and thoughtful way, consider liking the video and subscribing for more journeys into the past. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. Now, tonight's story concerns a man whose name has been praised as a national hero, condemned as a pirate, celebrated as an explorer, and feared as a ruthless raider. To some people, Francis Drake was England's greatest sailor. To others, he was little more than a thief with royal permission. And somewhere between those two versions lies a complicated truth. Because long before the British Empire stretched across the globe, before England ruled vast territories overseas, one man sailed into the unknown and helped change the balance of power in the world. But nearly every achievement attached to his name came with controversy. So, as we travel back into the 16th century, ask yourself one question. Was Francis Drake a hero, or simply the most successful pirate in history? The answer may be far more uncomfortable than either side would like to admit. The year was around 1540. England was a kingdom still finding its place among Europe's powerful nations. Spain possessed enormous wealth flowing from the Americas. Portuguese sailors had open routes around Africa and into Asia. Across the oceans, treasure fleets carried silver, gold, and valuable goods between continents. England, by comparison, remained relatively small in overseas influence. Into this world Francis Drake was born. Historians disagree about the exact date of his birth, but most place it around 1540 in Devon, a county in southwest England known for rugged coastlines and generations of seafarers. The sea was never far away. Fishing boats moved through coastal waters. Merchants crossed dangerous channels. Sailors returned with stories from distant lands few ordinary people would ever see. Young Drake grew up during a period of religious turmoil. England had broken away from the authority of Rome under King Henry VIII. Religious tensions affected communities throughout the kingdom. Drake's family experienced some of these disturbances directly, forcing them to relocate during his youth. These early experiences may have shaped his view of the world. Conflict seemed normal. Competition between nations seemed inevitable. And opportunities often belonged to those willing to take risks. As a boy, Drake entered maritime life remarkably early. Sources suggest he was apprenticed to the master of a small trading vessel. Imagine the scene. Cold winds crossing gray waters. Ropes creaking against wooden masts. Salt covering every surface. Long days of labor. No luxury. No comfort. No certainty of returning home. Life at sea in the 16th century was harsh beyond modern imagination. Storms could destroy ships within hours. Disease spread rapidly among crews. Navigation remained imperfect. Many sailors disappeared forever. Yet Drake appeared perfectly suited to this demanding environment. He learned quickly. He gained experience. And he developed a reputation for competence. As years passed, England's rivalry with Spain continued to grow. The Spanish Empire controlled enormous territories in the Americas. Mines in places such as modern-day Peru and Mexico produced staggering quantities of silver. Treasure ships transported wealth across the Atlantic, helping finance Spanish power throughout Europe. To English observers, these treasure fleets represented both opportunity and temptation. Officially, England and Spain were not always at war. Unofficially, many English sailors viewed Spanish shipping as a target. Private ventures blurred the line between trade, warfare, and outright piracy. This gray area would become the environment in which Francis Drake thrived. One of the most influential figures in his early career was his relative, John Hawkins. Hawkins was a skilled sailor and merchant. He was also deeply involved in one of history's darkest enterprises, the Atlantic slave trade. During the 16th century, Hawkins organized voyages that transported enslaved Africans across the ocean for sale in Spanish colonies. Drake joined some of these expeditions as a young man. This fact remains one of the most troubling aspects of his legacy. Modern discussions sometimes focus on Drake's later achievements while overlooking his participation in these voyages. Yet historical accuracy requires acknowledging the full picture. The world Drake inhabited was one shaped by imperial ambition, violence, and exploitation. He was not merely a witness to that system. He participated in it. The experiences nevertheless provided valuable maritime knowledge. Drake learned navigation. He learned logistics. He learned how overseas commerce operated. And, perhaps most importantly, he learned how wealth moved across oceans. In the late 1560s, Hawkins and Drake embarked upon another major voyage to the Caribbean. Initially, the expedition achieved commercial success, but events soon turned disastrous. Near the Mexican port of San Juan de Ulua, English ships encountered a powerful Spanish force. Tensions escalated rapidly. Negotiations broke down. Violence erupted. The resulting battle became one of the defining moments of Drake's life. Several English vessels were destroyed. Many sailors died. Survivors escaped only with great difficulty. For Drake, the encounter left a lasting impression. He blamed Spanish authorities for what he viewed as betrayal and treachery. Whether entirely justified or not, the experience appears to have hardened his attitude towards Spain permanently. From that point onward, much of his career would revolve around attacking Spanish interests. The young sailor who had once sought opportunity now carried something else as well: resentment, and perhaps a desire for revenge. Years later, that desire would help drive some of the most famous and infamous voyages in maritime history. Across the Atlantic, Spanish officials had little reason to suspect how dangerous this determined English mariner would become. Yet Francis Drake was already studying the routes of treasure ships. He was learning the geography of the Caribbean. He was gathering knowledge about ports, defenses, and weaknesses. And somewhere in those years, the future explorer began transforming into something far more formidable. A man who would soon challenge the greatest empire on Earth. A man whose raids would terrify Spanish governors from the Caribbean to the Pacific. A man who would eventually sail around the world itself. But before that extraordinary journey could begin, Drake first had to prove that he could strike Spain where it hurt most. And the coastlines of the New World were about to become his hunting ground. The coastlines of the Caribbean and the Spanish Main stretched for thousands of miles. Dense jungles pressed against narrow beaches. Small settlements clung to the edges of vast wilderness. Fortified ports guarded treasure routes that connected the riches of the Americas to Europe. Every year, silver and gold moved through these networks toward Spain, feeding the wealth of the empire and strengthening the power of King Philip II. For ambitious English sailors, these routes represented something irresistible: opportunity. By the early 1570s, Francis Drake had become increasingly determined to challenge Spanish control in the Americas. He was no longer merely learning the trade of seafaring. He was building a reputation as a daring commander capable of operating far from home. In 1572, Drake launched one of the ventures that would establish his fame throughout England. His target was Nombre de Dios, an important Spanish settlement on the Caribbean coast of present-day Panama. At first glance, the plan seemed almost impossible. The town was protected. Spanish forces were present. The region was filled with dangers. Yet Drake believed that surprise could accomplish what numbers could not. Under cover of darkness, English raiders approached the settlement. The attack initially achieved remarkable success. Spanish defenders were caught off guard. Drake and his men penetrated parts of the town and reached areas where treasure was stored. Then circumstances changed. During the fighting, Drake suffered a serious wound. Blood loss weakened him severely. His followers, concerned that their leader might die, decided to withdraw before securing the enormous wealth they had hoped to capture. The retreat was frustrating. So close to success. So close to treasure. And yet forced to leave empty-handed. Many men would have returned home after such disappointment. Drake did not. Instead, he remained in the region. Months turned into a prolonged campaign of observation, intelligence gathering, and opportunistic attacks. He learned the terrain. He studied Spanish movements. He developed relationships with groups hostile to Spanish authority. Among these were communities of escaped enslaved Africans known as Maroons. These groups possessed valuable knowledge of local geography and frequently resisted Spanish control. Cooperation between Drake's forces and the Maroons became an important factor in subsequent operations. One of the most famous moments of this period came during an expedition across the Isthmus of Panama. Traveling through dense tropical terrain, Drake reached a high point from which he could view an astonishing sight: the Pacific Ocean. For a European who had spent his life on the Atlantic side of the Americas, the view carried immense significance. According to later accounts, Drake climbed a tree to gain a clearer perspective. Looking westward, he saw the vast ocean stretching beyond the horizon. The moment stayed with him for years. He reportedly prayed that one day he might sail an English ship upon those distant waters. At the time, such an ambition seemed extraordinary. Spain dominated the Pacific. Few English sailors had ever ventured there. Yet Drake's imagination was already moving beyond ordinary limits. He was beginning to think globally. Meanwhile, practical opportunities continued to emerge. One operation became particularly famous. Spanish authorities transported treasure across Panama using mule trains that crossed the isthmus between the Pacific and Caribbean coasts. These shipments represented a critical link in Spain's imperial system. If intercepted, the rewards could be immense. Working with local allies, Drake gathered information about one such movement. Then, he prepared an ambush. The attack succeeded dramatically. English raiders captured substantial quantities of silver and other valuables. Contemporary accounts describe treasure so abundant that the attackers struggled to carry everything away. For Drake, the success confirmed something important. Spain's empire, despite its immense wealth, was vulnerable. Speed, intelligence, and boldness could overcome larger forces. News of these exploits spread. Among English audiences, Drake's reputation grew rapidly. He appeared fearless, resourceful, lucky. Stories of daring raids and captured treasure circulated through ports and taverns. Not everyone viewed him positively, of course. To Spanish officials, Drake was becoming something far more troubling: a pirate, a criminal, a persistent threat whose activities disrupted imperial commerce. These competing perspectives would follow him throughout his life. Hero in one country, villain in another. The distinction often depended entirely on which flag flew above a harbor. By 1573, Drake returned to England carrying wealth, experience, and valuable knowledge. The voyage transformed his status. He was no longer simply an ambitious sailor from Devon. He had become a figure of national interest. England itself was changing during these years. Queen Elizabeth I faced enormous challenges. Religious divisions persisted across Europe. Spain remained the dominant power. International politics grew increasingly tense. English leaders sought ways to weaken Spanish influence without provoking direct conflict that might prove disastrous. Men like Drake offered a useful option. They could strike at Spanish interests while maintaining a degree of plausible distance from official government policy. The arrangement suited both sides. Drake gained support. England gained a troublesome instrument against a powerful rival. Yet the most extraordinary chapter of his career still lay ahead. In the years following his return, plans began forming for an ambitious expedition unlike anything Drake had attempted before. Its objectives were complex: part exploration, part commerce, part military operation, part treasure hunt. The details remained secret. Even many participants did not fully understand the mission's scope. Such secrecy was necessary. If Spain discovered the plan, opposition would be swift. The proposed route would take English ships into regions where Spanish authority had long gone largely unchallenged. It would involve entering the Pacific Ocean. It would involve attacking targets thousands of miles from England. And ultimately, though few realized it at the outset, it would become one of the most famous voyages in world history. Preparations required considerable resources. Ships had to be equipped, crews recruited, supplies gathered, investors convinced. The enterprise carried enormous risks: storms, disease, shipwreck, Spanish retaliation. Any of these dangers could destroy the expedition before it achieved its objectives. Nevertheless, support emerged from influential quarters. Some historians believe Queen Elizabeth herself quietly encouraged the undertaking while maintaining enough distance to deny direct involvement if circumstances demanded. Such ambiguity characterized much of England's relationship with Drake's ventures. Officially cautious, unofficially interested. The result was an expedition that combined private ambition with national significance. By late 1577, preparations were largely complete. Several vessels assembled. Experienced sailors signed on. Families said farewell. Many participants expected a difficult journey. Few could imagine just how extraordinary it would become. Ahead lay the Atlantic Ocean. Ahead lay South America. Ahead lay storms that would scatter ships across dangerous seas. Ahead lay battles, treasure, mutiny, exploration, and survival. And somewhere beyond all those challenges waited the Pacific Ocean Drake had once viewed from a distant hilltop in Panama. Years earlier, standing among tropical forests, he had looked westward and dreamed of sailing English ships upon those waters. Now the opportunity was approaching. The dream was becoming reality. What began as a wounded raider's ambition was about to evolve into a voyage that would carry Francis Drake farther than almost any Englishman had ever traveled. The world itself was waiting beyond the horizon. The world itself was waiting beyond the horizon. On December 13th, 1577, Francis Drake and his fleet departed from Plymouth. The harbor slowly disappeared behind them as sails filled with winter winds. Families watched from shore. Merchants calculated risks and profits. Investors hoped for success. Sailors prepared for hardships they knew would come. No one could predict how many of those men would ever see England again. The expedition began with 5 ships. The flagship was known as the Pelican, a sturdy vessel that would later receive a new and more famous name. Alongside it sailed several smaller ships carrying supplies, equipment, weapons, and crew. The mission remained partly secret. Even many sailors aboard the fleet did not fully understand where they were ultimately heading. That uncertainty was common in long-distance voyages of the 16th century. Leaders often concealed objectives to protect plans from spies or potential enemies. As the fleet crossed the Atlantic, daily life settled into familiar routines. The sea could be beautiful. It could also be relentless. Sailors worked constantly. Ropes required maintenance. Sails demanded attention. Water and food supplies had to be managed carefully. Every storm threatened disaster. Meals were simple and often unpleasant. Fresh food spoiled quickly. Salted meat became a staple. Hard biscuits remained edible for long periods, but were rarely enjoyable. Fresh water sometimes developed foul tastes after weeks at sea. Yet these conditions were normal. Everyone aboard understood that comfort was not part of the bargain. The fleet eventually reached the coast of South America. From there, Drake continued southward. His destination was one of the most feared maritime passages in the world, the Strait of Magellan. Discovered decades earlier by the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan during his own historic voyage, the strait provided a narrow route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was dangerous. Cold winds howled through the channels. Rocky coastlines threatened ships. Weather changed rapidly. Navigation remained difficult even for experienced mariners. As Drake approached the region, tensions increased. The crews understood that they were entering one of the planet's most challenging maritime environments. The landscape itself seemed almost hostile. Jagged mountains rose from the water. Dark clouds drifted across distant peaks. Snow appeared on higher elevations. The farther south they traveled, the more remote the world became. Then another problem emerged: leadership disputes. One of the most controversial episodes of Drake's career unfolded during this period. Among the expedition's officers was Thomas Doughty. Doughty came from a respectable background and possessed influential connections. At some point during the voyage, relations between Drake and Doughty deteriorated severely. Historians continue debating the precise causes. Accusations included disobedience, undermining authority, and possible mutiny. The evidence remains complicated. What is certain is that Drake concluded Doughty represented a threat to the expedition. The matter eventually resulted in a trial. Far from England, far from ordinary legal institutions, conducted in a remote region near modern Patagonia. The outcome shocked many participants. Doughty was sentenced to death. In July 1578, he was executed. The incident remains one of the most controversial moments in Drake's life. Supporters argued that strong leadership was essential for survival during such a dangerous enterprise. Critics viewed the execution as excessive and deeply troubling. Centuries later, historians still debate whether justice was served. For Drake himself, however, the decision reinforced a message to the fleet. His authority would not be challenged. The voyage would continue under his command. Shortly afterward, another symbolic moment occurred. The Pelican was renamed the Golden Hind. The new name honored one of the expedition's principal supporters, Sir Christopher Hatton, whose family emblem featured a golden female deer, or hind. The ship would carry that name into history. At last, Drake entered the Strait of Magellan. For 16 difficult days, the fleet navigated the winding passage. The achievement itself was impressive. Many sailors considered the strait one of the greatest tests of seamanship. Yet an even greater challenge awaited beyond it. Upon reaching the Pacific Ocean, Drake encountered weather of astonishing violence. Massive storms battered the fleet. Powerful winds scattered ships across enormous distances. Some vessels became separated permanently. Others disappeared entirely. One ship turned back. Another was lost. The carefully assembled fleet that had departed England gradually fragmented under the force of nature. Drake himself struggled simply to survive. The Pacific was demonstrating that its name could be misleading. European explorers had often described parts of it as calm. In the far south, however, conditions could become ferocious. For weeks, storms dominated events. The Golden Hind endured wave after wave. Sailors worked desperately to keep the vessel afloat. Masts creaked under strain. Rigging snapped. Men fought exhaustion. Every hour seemed uncertain, yet the ship survived. And during this period, Drake may have observed something important. Accounts suggest that the storms drove him farther south than previous European navigators had traveled in the region. If true, these observations hinted that the southern tip of South America was not connected to a vast unknown continent as many Europeans believed. Instead, open ocean appeared to exist beyond it. The discovery carried geographical significance, although later explorers would confirm the details more fully. When calmer conditions finally returned, Drake faced a remarkable situation. Most of his original fleet was gone. Only the Golden Hind remained with him. One ship, one crew, thousands of miles from home, deep inside waters dominated by Spain. Many leaders might have chosen to abandon the mission and return to England. Drake chose the opposite. He pressed forward. The Pacific coast of South America stretched before him. Along that coastline lay Spanish settlements, ports, and treasure routes that had rarely faced attacks from foreign enemies. The Spanish did not expect English warships in these waters. Distance alone seemed sufficient protection. After all, few English vessels had ever reached the Pacific. Certainly not armed raiders prepared to strike valuable targets. That assumption would soon prove dangerously wrong. As the Golden Hind sailed northward, Drake encountered a series of opportunities. Spanish communities remained largely unprepared. Warnings traveled slowly. Many residents could scarcely believe reports that an English ship had entered the Pacific. The idea seemed almost impossible, yet the threat was real. Drake began conducting raids along the coast. Some resulted in supplies. Others produced valuable intelligence. Each success increased his confidence. Each captured vessel provided additional information about Spanish activities. And with every mile traveled northward, Drake moved deeper into one of the richest maritime regions in the world. Silver from Peru, gold from across the Americas, merchandise destined for Spain. All of it moved through networks Drake was now learning firsthand. The stage was being set for the most famous treasure capture of his entire career. A prize so valuable that stories about it would spread across Europe. A prize that would enrich investors beyond expectation, and a prize that would convince many English admirers that Francis Drake had become far more than a sailor. He had become a legend. He had become a legend. Yet in the closing months of 1578 and the opening months of 1579, that reputation was still being forged upon the waters of the Pacific. The Golden Hind sailed northward along the western coast of South America, moving through regions that Spain had long considered secure. For decades, treasure, supplies, official correspondence, and commercial goods had traveled these routes with relatively little fear of foreign attack. Distance itself served as a defensive wall. An English raider was the last thing Spanish authorities expected to encounter. News traveled slowly. One settlement might hear rumors weeks after an event had occurred elsewhere. By the time a warning reached the next port, Drake was often already gone. This advantage proved invaluable. Again and again, the Golden Hind appeared unexpectedly. Sometimes Spanish crews surrendered without serious resistance. In other cases, Drake obtained provisions and information through negotiation. At times, force remained an option, but surprise frequently achieved more than violence. The English commander understood something important. Information was treasure. Knowledge of shipping schedules, cargoes, coastal geography, and local defenses often proved more useful than weapons. As the voyage continued, reports accumulated regarding particularly valuable targets moving along the Pacific coast. Among Spanish sailors, one vessel attracted special attention. A large treasure ship traveling northward from Peru. The ship carried immense wealth: silver, gold, jewels, luxury goods. Years of imperial commerce concentrated into a single floating prize. To Drake, such a target represented an extraordinary opportunity. Finding it, however, would not be easy. The Pacific coastline extended for thousands of miles. Countless bays, inlets, and harbors interrupted the shore. Weather could change rapidly. Ships frequently altered schedules. Yet Drake persisted. His crew gathered intelligence from captured vessels and local sources. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. The treasure ship was real, and somewhere ahead it awaited. The Spanish vessel was known officially as the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción. English sailors later gave it a different nickname, the Cacafuego. The exact origin of the name remains debated, but it became permanently attached to the ship in English accounts. For weeks, anticipation grew aboard the Golden Hind. Sailors knew what was at stake. Success could transform the entire expedition. Failure would mean watching unimaginable wealth disappear over the horizon. Then, in March 1579, the opportunity arrived. Near the coast of present-day Ecuador, Drake's lookouts finally spotted their quarry. The moment must have been electrifying. Months of hardship, storms, losses, dangerous navigation, all leading toward this encounter. The English vessel closed the distance carefully. Drake employed deception, a tactic frequently used by naval commanders of the era. By controlling appearances and movements, ships could sometimes approach opponents before their true intentions became obvious. As the gap narrowed, Spanish confidence vanished. The approaching vessel was not a merchant. It was an enemy. And by the time the realization became clear, it was largely too late. The confrontation itself proved surprisingly brief. The Spanish ship, despite its valuable cargo, was not prepared for a prolonged fight against Drake's experienced crew. Resistance collapsed. The treasure ship fell into English hands. Then came the astonishing discovery. Cargo after cargo was examined. Silver bars, gold, jewelry, coins, precious goods. The scale exceeded expectations. Contemporary descriptions vary in detail, but all agree on one point. The captured wealth was enormous. So enormous that unloading, cataloging, and storing it became a major undertaking. For days, the crew worked among piles of treasure. The scene must have seemed almost unreal. Many sailors spent their entire lives hoping to glimpse such riches. Now they stood surrounded by them. The value of the capture remains difficult to calculate precisely in modern terms, but historians generally agree it represented one of the most profitable raids in English maritime history. Investors back home would eventually receive extraordinary returns. Queen Elizabeth herself would benefit significantly, and Francis Drake's reputation would soar to unprecedented heights. To English observers, the achievement appeared brilliant. To Spanish authorities, it was infuriating. A foreign raider had penetrated the Pacific, captured one of the empire's richest treasure ships, and escaped. The humiliation extended beyond financial loss. It exposed vulnerabilities. Spain's seemingly secure Pacific routes had been breached. The implications were serious. Meanwhile, Drake faced a new challenge. What should he do next? The Golden Hind now carried immense wealth. Returning safely to England became the highest priority. Yet the obvious routes presented dangers. Going back through the Strait of Magellan risked encountering Spanish forces waiting to intercept him. Alternative options involved enormous uncertainty. Maps remained incomplete. European knowledge of many regions was limited. Nevertheless, Drake continued northward. One possibility involved discovering a northern passage that might connect the Pacific to the Atlantic. European explorers had long speculated about such routes. The dream of a shortcut between oceans fascinated navigators and governments alike. If Drake could locate one, the achievement would rival any treasure capture. The Golden Hind therefore sailed farther north along the Pacific coast of North America. Temperatures changed. The climate grew cooler. Fog frequently appeared. The familiar tropical landscapes of South America gave way to entirely different environments. Accounts from the voyage become less certain during this phase. Exact locations remain debated by historians. Many details rely upon descriptions recorded after the expedition returned home. What seems clear is that Drake eventually reached a region along the western coast of North America, possibly within present-day California. There, he spent several weeks repairing the ship and preparing for the next stage of the journey. The stop became one of the most discussed episodes of the entire voyage. Local indigenous communities encountered the newcomers. Interactions occurred. Observations were recorded. Ceremonies took place. Drake reportedly claimed the area in the name of Queen Elizabeth, calling it Nova Albion or New Albion. The claim carried symbolic importance. England possessed little practical ability to enforce authority there at the time. Yet the gesture reflected growing ambitions. European powers increasingly viewed distant territories not merely as places to visit, but as lands to claim. Centuries of imperial expansion still lay ahead, but many foundations were already being established. As repairs continued, Drake and his crew prepared for the greatest uncertainty of the expedition: the return voyage across the Pacific. Unlike routes through the Atlantic, these waters remained unfamiliar to most English sailors. Distances were vast. Navigation challenges were immense. Fresh supplies remained limited. Mistakes could prove fatal. Yet staying in North America indefinitely was impossible. The treasure had to reach England. The crew had to survive. And somewhere beyond the horizon stretched an ocean larger than anything most Europeans had ever imagined. With the Golden Hind loaded with wealth beyond expectation, Francis Drake now faced the longest and perhaps most dangerous leg of his extraordinary journey. Ahead lay thousands upon thousands of miles of open sea. Ahead lay unfamiliar islands, unknown currents, unpredictable weather, and a route that would eventually carry him completely around the world. When the Golden Hind finally departed the western coast of North America in the summer of 1579, Francis Drake faced a challenge unlike any he had previously encountered. Raiding Spanish settlements was dangerous. Capturing treasure ships carried risks. Crossing the Strait of Magellan demanded courage. But now he was preparing for something even more uncertain. A vast ocean crossing over waters that very few English sailors had ever navigated. The Pacific Ocean stretched before him like an endless blue wilderness. No satellite maps. No accurate weather forecasts. No modern instruments. Only experience, calculation, observation, and faith in the skills of the crew. For weeks, then months, the Golden Hind moved westward. Day after day, the horizon looked almost unchanged. Water, sky, clouds, and the constant movement of the sea. To modern observers, it can be difficult to understand how isolated such voyages truly were. Once land disappeared behind the ship, there was no communication with the outside world. No rescue services. No possibility of calling for help. If disaster struck in mid-ocean, the world might never learn what happened. Every decision carried enormous weight. The crew depended entirely upon one another. Food and water supplies required careful management. Navigation demanded constant attention. Storms remained a permanent threat. Yet despite these dangers, Drake's ship continued steadily westward. The voyage brought the English sailors into regions rarely visited by Europeans. Various island groups appeared across the Pacific. Some provided opportunities to obtain fresh supplies. Others offered brief encounters with local populations whose lives had developed entirely separate from European affairs. For the sailors aboard the Golden Hind, these meetings could be astonishing. Languages differed. Customs differed. Clothing, tools, and traditions differed. The world revealed itself to be larger and more diverse than many Europeans had imagined. These encounters were often limited and imperfectly understood by both sides. Historical records, written largely from European perspectives, provide only partial glimpses into what occurred. Nevertheless, they remind us that Drake's voyage was not merely a story of England and Spain. It unfolded across a world already inhabited by countless societies with their own histories, cultures, and traditions. As the months passed, the Golden Hind eventually reached the islands of Southeast Asia. For centuries, these regions had been connected to extensive trade networks linking Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Spices remained among the most valuable commodities on Earth. European demand for cloves, nutmeg, pepper, and other goods had helped drive generations of exploration. Many voyages undertaken by European powers ultimately aimed at gaining access to these lucrative markets. Drake understood their value. The opportunity to acquire spices could significantly increase the expedition's profits beyond the treasure already aboard. In late 1579, the Golden Hind arrived near the islands of present-day Indonesia. One particularly important stop occurred in the Moluccas, often known historically as the Spice Islands. Here Drake entered into diplomatic exchanges with local rulers. Among them was the Sultan of Ternate, a powerful regional leader whose kingdom played an important role in the spice trade. The meeting reflected another side of Drake's career. He was not merely a raider. He could also function as a diplomat, negotiator, and representative of English interests. Relations between the visitors and local authorities appear to have remained generally positive. Trade agreements were arranged. Supplies were acquired. Valuable spices were loaded aboard the Golden Hind. The ship now carried an extraordinary cargo: silver from Spanish America, gold from captured prizes, jewels, luxury goods, and valuable spices from Southeast Asia. The voyage had become a commercial triumph as well as a geographical achievement. Yet danger remained close. One of the most serious incidents occurred near the island of Celebes, part of modern Indonesia. While navigating unfamiliar waters, the Golden Hind struck a reef. The situation was terrifying. A heavily loaded ship trapped upon underwater rocks could easily be lost. If the vessel broke apart, years of effort might vanish beneath the sea. The treasure, the spices, the records, the crew, everything stood at risk. Sailors worked desperately. Cargo was shifted. Repairs were attempted. Prayers were offered. Hours passed with agonizing uncertainty. Fortunately for Drake and his men, changing conditions eventually allowed the ship to free itself. The escape felt miraculous. Had events unfolded slightly differently, Francis Drake's story might have ended there, far from England and far from the fame that awaited him. The voyage continued. Crossing the Indian Ocean introduced new challenges. Long distances tested supplies. Changing weather patterns demanded careful navigation. The crew had already spent years away from home. Many men must have wondered whether they would ever see England again. Life aboard ship remained exhausting. Even successful voyages involved constant labor. Sails required maintenance. Hull damage needed repairs. Equipment deteriorated. Disease remained a threat. Fresh food often disappeared quickly after each landfall. By modern standards, conditions were extremely harsh. Yet the sailors endured. One reason may have been simple. They knew what rested below deck. Treasure. More treasure than most of them had ever imagined. The possibility of returning home wealthy provided a powerful incentive. As 1580 approached, the Golden Hind rounded the southern tip of Africa. The famous Cape Route had become one of the most important maritime corridors in the world. Portuguese navigators had pioneered its use decades earlier. Now Drake followed a path that connected the Indian Ocean with the Atlantic. Compared to some earlier phases of the voyage, this portion proved relatively successful. The ship survived storms. Navigation remained effective. Gradually, the familiar waters of the Atlantic came closer. The psychological effect must have been enormous. For years, the crew had traveled through distant oceans. Now Europe was no longer an abstract destination. It was becoming reachable, day by day, week by week. The possibility of home grew stronger. Meanwhile, England knew almost nothing about Drake's fate. Many people assumed he was dead. The voyage had lasted far longer than expected. News traveled slowly. Rumors circulated. Some reports claimed disaster. Others suggested success. No one could be certain. The oceans had swallowed countless expeditions before. Why should this one be different? Yet it was different. Remarkably different. Because Francis Drake had achieved something almost unimaginable for an English sailor of his generation. He had crossed the Atlantic, passed through the Strait of Magellan, raided Spanish settlements across the Pacific, captured one of the richest treasure ships in the world, reached North America, crossed the Pacific Ocean, visited Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, rounded Africa, and now he was approaching home. The voyage was becoming one of the greatest maritime achievements of the 16th century. Still, one final stage remained. One final stretch of ocean separated the Golden Hind from England. Ahead waited the harbors of home. Ahead waited astonished investors. Ahead waited Queen Elizabeth herself. And ahead waited a reception that would transform Francis Drake from a successful sailor into one of the most celebrated figures in English history. And ahead waited a reception that would transform Francis Drake from a successful sailor into one of the most celebrated figures in English history. On September 26, 1580, nearly 3 years after departing England, the Golden Hind sailed into Plymouth Harbor. The sight must have seemed almost unbelievable. Families who had long assumed their loved ones were dead suddenly saw a familiar ship approaching the coast. Merchants rushed to gather information. Officials demanded reports. Sailors crowded docks to hear news from lands most of them would never visit. The voyage had exceeded nearly every expectation. Francis Drake and his surviving crew had accomplished something extraordinary. Only a handful of expeditions in human history had successfully circumnavigated the globe. Now an English expedition had joined that small and remarkable group. Word spread quickly. The ship carried treasure. Lots of treasure. The exact value remains difficult to determine, but contemporary estimates suggest that the profits were staggering. Investors received returns that transformed the expedition into one of the most successful financial ventures of the Elizabethan era. The English crown benefited enormously as well. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly received a share of the profits so large that it significantly strengthened royal finances. At a time when England often struggled to compete economically with larger European powers, the windfall attracted enormous attention. The Queen, however, faced a delicate political situation. Spain and England were not yet officially at war. Openly celebrating attacks on Spanish shipping could create serious diplomatic problems. As a result, much of the expedition's documentation remained carefully controlled. Some records were restricted. Details were handled cautiously. Spanish ambassadors protested vigorously. From their perspective, Drake was not a heroic explorer. He was a pirate who had stolen enormous wealth from Spanish subjects. The complaints were understandable. Imagine how any nation would react if a foreign commander appeared unexpectedly, seized treasure worth a fortune, and sailed away successfully. Yet Queen Elizabeth saw matters differently. Drake had weakened a rival. He had demonstrated English naval capabilities, and he had returned wealth that strengthened England's position. The benefits were difficult to ignore. In April 1581, one of the most famous ceremonies of Drake's life took place. The Queen visited the Golden Hind. The ship itself had become a symbol of national pride, a vessel that had crossed oceans and survived dangers beyond counting, a vessel that had carried England around the world. Aboard the ship, Queen Elizabeth formally knighted Francis Drake. From that day forward, he became Sir Francis Drake. The ceremony carried tremendous symbolic significance. Spain viewed him as a criminal. England now honored him as a knight. The contrast perfectly captured the controversy surrounding his legacy. To admirers, he embodied courage, skill, and determination. To critics, he represented state-sponsored piracy. The debate began during his own lifetime and continues centuries later. Regardless of perspective, one fact remained undeniable. His achievements had altered England's reputation. European observers could no longer dismiss English seafaring ambitions. The voyage demonstrated that English sailors could operate on a global scale. This mattered enormously. The late 16th century was becoming an age of competition among maritime powers. Control of trade routes, colonies, and naval strength increasingly shaped international politics. Drake's success inspired others. Young sailors listened to stories of the circumnavigation. Investors became more interested in overseas ventures. Government officials considered broader strategic possibilities. The ocean seemed a little smaller. The world seemed a little more accessible. Yet success brought new dangers. Spain had not forgotten. King Philip II ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth. Its territories stretched across Europe, the Americas, Asia, and beyond. Its resources dwarfed those available to England. Spanish officials remained deeply angered by Drake's actions. The treasure losses alone created resentment. The humiliation created even more. As relations between England and Spain deteriorated during the 1580s, Drake increasingly found himself involved in larger national struggles. Religious conflict contributed to tensions. Political rivalries intensified. Commercial competition expanded. Europe's most powerful Catholic monarchy and its increasingly Protestant rival moved steadily toward confrontation. Drake stood near the center of that conflict. His knowledge of Spanish shipping and overseas territories made him uniquely valuable. His experience inspired confidence among English leaders, and his reputation terrified many Spanish officials. One Spanish nickname for Drake became particularly famous. They called him El Drac, the dragon. The title reflected both fear and hostility. Across Spanish America, stories circulated about his raids. Governors worried about his appearance. Merchants feared his attacks. The mere rumor of Drake's presence could trigger alarm. Such reactions demonstrate the psychological impact he achieved. Military success involves more than winning battles. Sometimes reputation itself becomes a weapon. Meanwhile, Drake remained active. He invested in new ventures. He participated in public affairs. And he continued to support English maritime expansion. Yet peace between England and Spain grew increasingly fragile. Events across Europe pushed the two nations closer toward open conflict. The Netherlands, then under Spanish rule, experienced prolonged unrest and rebellion. Religious divisions sharpened. Political tensions deepened. Diplomatic solutions became harder to achieve. Many observers sensed that war was approaching. If it came, naval power would play a crucial role. England needed experienced commanders. Few possessed credentials comparable to Drake's. He had sailed farther than most, fought more extensively than many rivals, and survived circumstances that would have destroyed lesser leaders. As the decade advanced, preparations quietly accelerated. Ships were improved, defenses strengthened, plans discussed. No one knew exactly when confrontation would occur, but many understood that it was becoming increasingly likely. For Drake personally, the years following his circumnavigation represented a transition. He was no longer merely an adventurer seeking fortune. He had become a national figure, a strategic asset, a symbol of English resistance to Spanish dominance. The oceans that once offered opportunities for private raids were becoming theaters of international conflict. And before long, Drake would once again lead ships into dangerous waters. Not simply in search of treasure, not merely in pursuit of glory, but as part of a growing struggle between two rival powers whose conflict would help shape the future of the Atlantic world. The greatest military challenge of his life was still ahead, and far across the sea, Spain was already preparing a response. By the middle years of the 1580s, the relationship between England and Spain had deteriorated to a level that made conflict seem increasingly unavoidable. For decades, tensions had simmered beneath the surface. Religious differences divided the two kingdoms. Commercial competition intensified across the Atlantic. Political disputes spread throughout Europe. And hovering over everything was the growing hostility created by English attacks on Spanish interests overseas. Few English commanders symbolized that hostility more clearly than Sir Francis Drake. Spanish officials followed his activities closely. Reports mentioning his name circulated through government offices, colonial administrations, and military headquarters. Wherever Drake appeared, trouble often followed. King Philip II had reasons to be concerned. The Spanish Empire depended upon maritime connections. Treasure fleets crossed the Atlantic, carrying wealth from the Americas. Supplies moved between colonies and Europe. Communication relied heavily upon ships. Any disruption threatened imperial stability. Drake understood these vulnerabilities better than most men alive. He had seen the system from within. He knew its strengths. He knew its weaknesses. And he intended to exploit them. In 1585, Queen Elizabeth authorized a major expedition under Drake's command. This venture differed from many earlier raids. The scale was larger, the objectives broader, the political implications far more serious. England and Spain still had not formally declared war, but the line separating peace from conflict had become extremely thin. Drake sailed with a substantial fleet. His targets included Spanish possessions in the Atlantic and Caribbean. The expedition represented a direct challenge to Spanish authority. One of the first major objectives was the port city of Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola. Today the city remains the capital of the Dominican Republic, but in Drake's time it served as one of Spain's most important colonial centers. The attack shocked local authorities. English forces captured the city and held it temporarily while demanding ransom. The event demonstrated that even major Spanish settlements were vulnerable. For local residents, the experience must have been alarming. For English observers, it appeared to confirm Drake's effectiveness. From Santo Domingo, the expedition continued toward Cartagena. Located in present-day Colombia, Cartagena was one of the wealthiest and most important Spanish ports in the Americas. Its defenses were stronger. Resistance proved more determined. Nevertheless, Drake eventually secured control of the city. Again, ransom became a central feature of events. Spanish colonial authorities faced difficult choices: pay large sums, or risk destruction and prolonged occupation. The campaign produced mixed results. Financial gains existed. Military successes occurred. Yet disease increasingly affected both crews and soldiers. Tropical conditions posed constant challenges. Heat, humidity, and illness weakened many participants. As often happened in 16th century warfare, disease sometimes proved as dangerous as enemy action. The expedition continued through various parts of the Caribbean before eventually returning toward England. Although not every objective was achieved perfectly, the campaign reinforced Drake's reputation as Spain's most persistent maritime enemy. Spanish anger deepened. English confidence grew. And relations between the two kingdoms moved even closer to open war. The following years witnessed a dramatic escalation. In Europe, religious and political conflicts intensified. Queen Elizabeth's support for Protestant causes angered Philip II. English assistance to Dutch rebels challenged Spanish authority in the Netherlands. Diplomatic efforts repeatedly failed. By 1587, intelligence reached England suggesting that Spain was preparing a major fleet. Its purpose seemed clear: an invasion of England itself. The threat was enormous. Spain possessed greater resources, more territory, more population, more wealth. If a large invasion force successfully crossed the English Channel, England could face disaster. The government urgently sought ways to delay Spanish preparations. Once again, Francis Drake received an important assignment. In the spring of 1587, he sailed toward Spain. His mission involved striking enemy ports before the invasion fleet could fully assemble. The operation became one of the most famous preemptive attacks in naval history. Drake entered the harbor of Cadiz, a critical Spanish naval center. The attack caught many defenders by surprise. English ships moved aggressively. Vessels were destroyed. Supplies damaged. Preparations disrupted. The raid inflicted significant losses and delayed Spanish plans. Drake later described the operation with characteristic confidence. He claimed to have singed the King of Spain's beard. The phrase became famous. Behind the humor lay a serious achievement. The attack bought England valuable time. Months mattered. Every delay improved English chances of preparing defenses. Spanish officials were furious. Yet the damage had been done. The invasion would not proceed immediately. Meanwhile, anticipation spread across Europe. Everyone understood that a major confrontation was approaching. Merchants discussed it. Diplomats reported on it. Military leaders planned for it. The coming struggle would involve not merely England and Spain, but the future balance of power in Europe. Drake spent much of this period helping prepare England's naval defenses. His experience proved invaluable. He understood Spanish methods. He understood long-distance naval operations. And he understood how quickly circumstances could change at sea. Along England's southern coast, preparations accelerated. Ships underwent repairs. Supplies accumulated. Crews trained. Lookouts watched the horizon. An atmosphere of nervous expectation settled across the kingdom. No one knew exactly when the Spanish fleet would appear, only that it almost certainly would. For ordinary people, the uncertainty must have been unsettling. Rumors circulated constantly. Some exaggerated Spanish strength. Others exaggerated English readiness. The truth remained difficult to determine. What was clear was that England faced one of the greatest threats in its history. The memories of foreign invasions remained powerful. Generations had passed since England last confronted such a challenge, yet the possibility still inspired fear. Drake, however, had spent much of his life confronting uncertainty. Storms, battles, treasure hunts, mutinies, long ocean crossings. Danger had become familiar. Now he prepared for a different kind of test. A struggle not for treasure, but for national survival. As 1588 approached, reports confirmed what many already suspected. Spain had completed preparations for a massive fleet. Hundreds of ships, thousands of sailors, soldiers, officers, and support personnel assembled for the enterprise. The fleet would become known to history by a famous name: the Spanish Armada. Its mission was ambitious. Its scale was immense. And its arrival would place Francis Drake at the center of one of the most celebrated chapters in English history. Across the waters of the Channel, the storm was gathering. Soon the horizon would fill with sails. Soon the horizon would fill with sails. During the summer of 1588, anticipation spread across England like a slow-moving storm. For months, rumors had circulated regarding Spain's plans. Reports arrived from spies, merchants, diplomats, and travelers. Some stories proved inaccurate. Others contained fragments of truth. But now there was little doubt. The fleet was coming. King Philip II had committed enormous resources to the enterprise. The objective was not simply a naval demonstration. Spain intended to establish control of the English Channel, link up with forces in the Netherlands, and create conditions for an invasion of England. The consequences could be historic: religion, politics, trade, national independence. All seemed to be at stake. Along England's coast, preparations intensified. Signal beacons stood ready on hilltops. Ships assembled in strategic locations. Local authorities organized defenses. The population watched the sea with growing concern. For many people, the approaching armada seemed almost unstoppable. Spain possessed one of the greatest military systems in the world. Its empire stretched across continents. Its armies had earned formidable reputations. Its treasure fleets carried wealth on a scale unmatched by most rivals. Facing such a power was intimidating. Yet England possessed advantages of its own. One of them was experience. Men like Francis Drake had spent years operating at sea under difficult conditions. English naval commanders often favored mobility, aggressive maneuvering, and long-range gunnery. Their ships tended to be faster and more flexible than many larger Spanish vessels. These differences would matter. As July 1588 progressed, the expected reports finally arrived. The Armada had entered the waters approaching England. Lookouts observed the fleet. Messengers carried news inland. Church bells rang. Signal systems transmitted warnings. Across southern England, people realized that history was unfolding before their eyes. Descriptions of the Armada vary, but contemporary observers consistently emphasized its scale. The fleet stretched across the horizon. Ships of many sizes traveled together. Warships, supply vessels, transports, armed escorts. Hundreds of sails moved through the channel. The sight must have been extraordinary. For English sailors preparing to oppose it, the challenge appeared immense. Francis Drake served as one of England's senior naval commanders during the campaign. Years of experience had prepared him for moments exactly like this. He understood Spanish tactics. He understood the importance of logistics. And he understood that direct confrontation alone might not produce victory. The English strategy relied upon flexibility. Rather than seeking a single decisive battle immediately, commanders aimed to harass the Armada, exploit maneuverability, and weaken the fleet over time. The campaign that followed unfolded through a series of engagements. English ships attacked from favorable positions. Cannons exchanged fire across the water. Crews worked tirelessly. Smoke drifted across the sea. Commands echoed over the wind. Throughout these encounters, Drake played an important role. One famous story from the campaign, whether entirely accurate or somewhat embellished by later retellings, illustrates his reputation. According to tradition, Drake was playing a game of bowls when informed that the Armada had been sighted. Rather than reacting with panic, he reportedly remarked that there was sufficient time to finish the game and still defeat the Spaniards. Historians continue debating aspects of the story. Regardless of its precise accuracy, the tale survived because it captured how many people viewed Drake. Calm, confident, unshaken by danger. As the fighting continued, English tactics began producing results. The Armada struggled to achieve its objectives. Communication difficulties emerged. Coordination challenges increased. English attacks repeatedly disrupted Spanish operations, yet the fleet remained dangerous. The outcome remained uncertain. One of the most important moments occurred near Calais on the French coast. The Spanish fleet anchored while awaiting developments involving forces in the Netherlands. English commanders recognized an opportunity. During the night, they launched fireships. The concept was simple but effective. Older vessels were loaded with combustible materials, set ablaze, and sent drifting toward the anchored Spanish fleet. The sight must have been terrifying. In darkness, large burning ships moved toward crowded anchorage areas. Spanish captains feared explosions and destruction. Many cut anchor cables and maneuvered away rapidly. The formation that had helped maintain order became disrupted. Confusion spread. The following day, English forces exploited the situation. The resulting engagement near Gravelines became one of the decisive moments of the campaign. English ships attacked aggressively. Artillery fire intensified. Spanish vessels suffered damage. Although the Armada was not destroyed outright, its ability to carry out the original invasion plan weakened significantly. Weather also played an important role. Strong winds complicated Spanish efforts. Conditions increasingly pushed the fleet away from its intended objectives. Gradually, strategic reality became unavoidable. The invasion would not occur. The Armada could no longer achieve its mission. Spanish commanders faced difficult choices. Retreat offered the most practical option. Yet returning home was not simple. English naval pressure continued. The channel remained dangerous. Eventually, Spanish leaders chose a route around the northern coasts of Scotland and Ireland. The decision introduced new hazards. The waters were challenging. Weather conditions deteriorated. Navigation errors became costly. Storms struck repeatedly. Shipwrecks occurred along rugged coastlines. Many lives were lost. The retreat became a disaster for portions of the fleet. It is important, however, not to oversimplify events. The Armada remained a formidable force. Many ships survived. Spain itself remained powerful after 1588. The campaign did not suddenly end Spanish influence or transform England into an uncontested global power. History is rarely that simple. Nevertheless, the outcome carried enormous symbolic significance. England had resisted one of the greatest military enterprises of the age. The invasion threat had been defeated. National confidence surged. And among the figures associated with that achievement, Francis Drake occupied a prominent place. Public admiration increased further. Stories circulated through towns and ports. Ballads celebrated the victory. Paintings commemorated the campaign. The Armada became part of England's national memory. For Drake personally, the success reinforced an image already decades in the making. Explorer, commander, privateer, national hero. The labels varied depending on perspective, but his fame continued to grow. Yet despite the celebrations, the struggle between England and Spain was far from over. War continued, raids continued, ambitions continued. The oceans remained contested, and Drake himself, now one of the most recognizable men in England, would soon return to the sea once more. The years ahead would bring new expeditions, new victories, new disappointments, and eventually, the final chapter of a remarkable life. But for the moment, as news of the Armada's failure spread across Europe, Francis Drake stood near the height of his reputation. The man once condemned as a pirate by Spain had helped confront the greatest fleet his enemy could assemble. And the legend surrounding his name was only growing larger. In the months that followed the defeat of the Spanish Armada, England celebrated one of the most important military successes in its history. Church services gave thanks. Poets praised the nation's survival. Political leaders highlighted the achievement as evidence of divine favor and national determination. Throughout the kingdom, the victories strengthened confidence in England's future. Yet for Francis Drake, life did not suddenly become peaceful. The sea had shaped nearly every chapter of his existence, and it continued to call him back. Although the Armada had failed, Spain remained a powerful empire. Its colonies still stretched across the Americas. Its fleets still crossed oceans. Its armies still operated throughout Europe. The war between England and Spain continued, and both sides searched for opportunities to gain advantage. In 1589, English leaders authorized a major expedition, often called the English Armada or the Counter Armada. The idea seemed promising. If Spain had failed to invade England, perhaps England could now strike back. The expedition's objectives were ambitious. Destroy remaining Spanish naval strength. Support anti-Spanish forces in Portugal. Capture valuable ports. Potentially alter the balance of power in Western Europe. Drake received a leading role in the operation alongside Sir John Norris. At first glance, the plan appeared bold and exciting. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that ambitious plans do not always produce successful outcomes. The campaign soon encountered difficulties. Coordination problems emerged. Supplies proved inadequate. Strategic goals became harder to achieve than expected. Spanish resistance remained stronger than many English planners had anticipated. Disease again affected large numbers of participants. Operations that looked straightforward on paper became far more complicated in reality. The expedition ultimately failed to achieve most of its major objectives. For Drake, the experience served as a reminder that even celebrated commanders could not guarantee success. Victories often receive enormous attention. Failures receive less. Yet both reveal important truths about historical figures. Drake's career contained moments of brilliance, but it also included setbacks, frustrations, and miscalculations. No commander wins every campaign. Despite the disappointment, his reputation survived. Years of previous achievements remained influential. His circumnavigation of the globe, his Pacific raids, his role during the Armada campaign, these accomplishments continued to define public perceptions. At the same time, Drake increasingly became involved in broader national affairs. Success had brought wealth. Wealth brought influence. Like many prominent Elizabethan figures, he acquired property and participated in public life beyond maritime activities. His connections with political leaders strengthened. His advice carried weight. His experiences offered valuable insight into matters of trade, defense, and overseas expansion. Yet it was impossible for him to remain completely separated from the world of naval conflict. England's future increasingly depended upon maritime power. Trade routes expanded. Exploration continued. Competition among European powers intensified. The oceans represented opportunity, but they also represented danger. Drake's life stood at the intersection of both. Around this time, his image within England began evolving further. Stories about his adventures circulated widely. Some accounts emphasized courage, others focused on treasure. Many highlighted dramatic escapes, daring attacks, and extraordinary voyages. As often happens with famous individuals, fact and legend sometimes became difficult to separate. Historical events were retold around fireplaces, in taverns, aboard ships, and within printed works. Each retelling occasionally added new details or emphasized certain aspects more strongly than others. The result was a growing mythology. Francis Drake became more than a man. He became a symbol. To many English people, he represented national confidence. Proof that England could challenge larger powers. Proof that determination and skill could overcome disadvantages. Yet outside England, reactions often differed sharply. In Spain and many Spanish territories, memories of Drake remained deeply negative. Communities affected by his raids remember destruction, loss, and fear. Spanish officials viewed him through an entirely different lens. To them, the title of hero seemed inappropriate. The word pirate felt more accurate. This contrast remains one of the most fascinating aspects of Drake's legacy. Historical figures often appear differently depending on where one stands. A national hero in one country may be remembered very differently elsewhere. Drake exemplifies that reality. The same actions that earned praise in England generated resentment across the Spanish Empire. Both perspectives emerged from real experiences. As the 1590s progressed, age slowly began affecting the generation of explorers who had transformed the Elizabethan world. Many veterans of earlier voyages were no longer young men. Years spent at sea took a physical toll. Storms, battles, disease, exhaustion. The maritime life was demanding. Even the most successful sailors could not escape time. Drake himself was now far removed from the ambitious young mariner who had first ventured into Atlantic waters. He had accumulated wealth, honors, and fame. He had traveled farther than most people of his era could imagine. He had witnessed distant continents, cultures, and oceans. He had participated in events that altered the course of history. Yet retirement never seemed entirely comfortable for him. The sea remained central to his identity. New opportunities and new conflicts continued to emerge. English leaders still valued his expertise. His name still carried authority. And overseas, Spanish treasure fleets continued moving across the Atlantic. Those fleets remained tempting targets. Meanwhile, the broader world was changing rapidly. European exploration accelerated. Commercial networks expanded. Maps improved. Knowledge accumulated. The generation that followed Drake would inherit a world increasingly connected by maritime routes. In many ways, his voyages had helped make that transformation possible. The circumnavigation alone demonstrated the practical realities of global navigation on an unprecedented scale for England. Young sailors studying his achievements could imagine possibilities their fathers might never have considered. Across ports and shipyards, new ambitions took shape. Yet before Drake's remarkable life reached its conclusion, one final major expedition awaited him. It would carry him back toward the Caribbean. back toward waters where some of his earliest and most famous exploits had occurred, back toward regions where Spain still possessed immense wealth and strategic importance. The mission would offer opportunities for renewed glory, but it would also expose him to risks that no amount of experience could completely overcome. For the aging sea captain, the horizon was opening once again, and beyond that horizon waited the last voyage of Francis Drake. And beyond that horizon waited the last voyage of Francis Drake. By the mid-1590s, Sir Francis Drake was no longer the young adventurer who had first sailed across the Atlantic in search of opportunity. More than 3 decades had passed since those early voyages. His hair had grayed. His face carried the marks of years spent beneath harsh sun, ocean winds, and constant pressure. Yet despite advancing age, he remained one of England's most recognizable and respected naval commanders. Many veterans of his generation had already died. Others had withdrawn from active service. Drake, however, continued to accept difficult assignments. The war between England and Spain showed little sign of ending. Both nations remained determined. Both continued to search for advantages. And both understood that control of maritime routes remained critically important. In 1595, English leaders approved another major expedition aimed at Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. The operation would be commanded jointly by 2 famous figures, Francis Drake and his old associate, Sir John Hawkins. The partnership carried symbolic weight. For decades, both men had participated in many of England's most significant overseas ventures. Together they represented an earlier generation of explorers, privateers, and naval commanders. Yet time was no longer entirely on their side. The expedition departed England with ambitious objectives. Spanish treasure remained an attractive target. The Caribbean continued to serve as a vital artery connecting Spain's American possessions with Europe. Disrupting those connections could weaken Spanish power while enriching English interests, at least in theory. In practice, circumstances had changed. Spanish defenses were stronger than they had been during Drake's earlier raids. Officials throughout the empire understood the threat he posed. Ports were better prepared. Fortifications improved. Warnings traveled more efficiently. The element of surprise, once among Drake's greatest advantages, had become harder to achieve. News of English intentions reached Spanish authorities before the expedition arrived. As a result, many targets proved more difficult than expected. Almost immediately, problems began to emerge. One early setback involved the Canary Islands. Attempts to secure certain objectives failed. Resistance proved effective. Momentum suffered. Then an even more serious blow occurred. During the Atlantic crossing, Sir John Hawkins became ill. His condition deteriorated rapidly. For Drake, the situation must have been deeply personal. The 2 men shared a long and complicated history. They had sailed together decades earlier. They had participated in controversial ventures. They had witnessed both triumphs and disasters. Now, far from home, Hawkins was dying. In November 1595, he passed away aboard ship. The loss affected the expedition profoundly. It also reminded everyone of a difficult reality. The generation that had shaped England's rise as a maritime power was aging. Mortality could not be avoided. Drake continued the mission, but circumstances remained challenging. Spanish defenses repeatedly frustrated English plans. One important target was the city of San Juan in present-day Puerto Rico. The harbor held strategic value. Capturing it would provide significant advantages. Yet Spanish preparations proved effective. Defenders resisted strongly. English attacks failed to achieve decisive success. For a commander accustomed to bold victories, the experience must have been frustrating. The campaign then shifted toward other objectives in the Caribbean. Ships moved between islands and coastal settlements. Operations continued, but the expedition never developed the momentum many participants had hoped for. Disease became an increasingly serious problem. This was hardly unusual. Throughout history, tropical environments posed immense challenges for European expeditions. Mosquito-borne illnesses, contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, and unfamiliar diseases often caused devastating losses. Armies and fleets frequently suffered more from sickness than from enemy action. Drake's expedition proved no exception. Conditions aboard ships deteriorated. Men weakened. Medical knowledge remained limited. The treatments available during the 16th century rarely addressed underlying causes effectively. As the weeks passed, illness spread through the ranks. Meanwhile, Drake himself began showing signs of declining health. Years of strenuous activity had taken their toll. He was in his mid-50s, an age that carried greater significance in the 16th century than it often does today. The cumulative effects of a lifetime at sea could not be ignored forever. Still, he continued working. Still, he continued planning. Still, he continued commanding. The determination that had carried him around the world remained intact. Yet determination alone could not defeat disease. In early 1596, while operating near the coast of Panama, Drake's condition worsened significantly. Historical sources generally identified dysentery as the likely cause. The illness was common and often deadly. Without modern medical treatment, even relatively ordinary infections could become fatal. As weakness increased, it became increasingly clear that recovery was unlikely. The realization must have been sobering. For decades, Drake had survived dangers that seemed almost impossible to overcome. Storms in the Pacific, battles against enemy fleets, long voyages through unknown waters, mutiny, shipwreck risks, countless hazards that might have ended his life. Yet now a disease threatened to accomplish what enemy nations had failed to do. The contrast is striking. History often remembers dramatic moments, grand battles, epic voyages, heroic escapes. But many historical lives ended not in combat, but through illness. Drake's story would follow that pattern. On January 28, 1596, Sir Francis Drake died off the coast of Panama. He was approximately 55 years old. News of his death spread through the fleet. For many sailors, it marked the end of an era. One of England's most famous seafarers was gone. The man who had circumnavigated the globe. The man who had raided Spanish treasure routes across 2 oceans. The man who had helped oppose the Spanish Armada. The man known to admirers as a hero and to enemies as a pirate. Now his extraordinary journey had come to an end. His burial reflected the maritime life he had lived. According to accounts, Drake's body was placed within a lead-lined coffin. The coffin was then committed to the sea near Portobello, Panama. The ocean that had shaped his entire existence became his final resting place. No grand tomb awaited him. No monument overlooking a city. Only the waters he had crossed so many times before. Somewhere beneath those waves, his burial place remains unknown. The sea kept it secret. Yet while the man had died, the arguments surrounding his life were only beginning. Almost immediately, people began debating how he should be remembered. Explorer, privateer, patriot, pirate, hero, villain. The labels varied depending on who was telling the story. And over the centuries that followed, those debates would become even more intense. Because Francis Drake's legacy would prove nearly as controversial as the life he lived. Francis Drake's legacy would prove nearly as controversial as the life he lived. After his death in 1596, the immediate reactions in England were shaped less by reflection and more by the urgent realities of war. The conflict with Spain was still ongoing, and Drake had died while actively engaged in that struggle. In that sense, his passing was not treated as the closing of a distant historical chapter, but as the loss of a working commander in an unfinished campaign. Ships continued to operate in the Caribbean after his burial at sea. Reports of Spanish resistance, English setbacks, and ongoing disease circulated through the fleet. Without Drake's leadership, coordination became more difficult. The expedition gradually lost coherence and ultimately failed to achieve its strategic goals. Back in England, however, the tone was different. Public memory tends to simplify complicated figures, especially those associated with national pride. Drake was remembered first and foremost as the man who had helped defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. That event had become a defining moment in English national identity. It was framed as a struggle for survival, independence, and divine protection. Within that narrative, Drake occupied a central role. His earlier circumnavigation of the globe also continued to hold symbolic weight. In a period when global geography was still being actively mapped by Europeans, the idea that an English sailor had completed a full voyage around the world carried immense prestige. It suggested competence, courage, and capability on a global scale. But memory is selective. The parts of Drake's career involving raids, privateering, and participation in the broader system of Atlantic exploitation were often treated differently depending on the audience. In England, these actions were frequently described in terms of national defense or justified retaliation against Spain. In Spanish records and colonial accounts, the same actions were described in far harsher terms: piracy, theft, and violence against civilians and imperial property. Both descriptions were rooted in real experiences. Both reflected genuine consequences of his actions. And both continue to shape modern interpretations of his life. Over time, historians have increasingly moved away from simple heroic or villainous labels. Instead, Drake is more commonly analyzed within the context of 16th century maritime warfare and imperial competition. That world operated under different assumptions than modern international law. Privateering, state-authorized attacks on enemy shipping, was a recognized practice among European powers. It existed in a legal and political gray zone where national interest, commerce, and warfare overlapped. Drake operated directly within that system. He was not unique in doing so. Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Dutch seafarers all engaged in similar activities when conditions allowed. What made Drake distinctive was the scale of his success and the symbolic importance later assigned to his voyages. The circumnavigation, in particular, remains one of the most significant maritime achievements of the early modern period. It demonstrated that global navigation was not merely theoretical, but practically achievable with the ships and knowledge available at the time. It also reinforced England's emerging identity as a maritime nation increasingly oriented toward the sea, toward trade, toward exploration, toward competition across oceans rather than solely across land borders. At the same time, modern historical analysis places greater emphasis on aspects of Drake's career that were once minimized in celebratory narratives. His involvement in early English participation in the Atlantic slave trade under John Hawkins is now widely acknowledged as part of his biography. These voyages were not peripheral. They were formative experiences in his early maritime career and reflect the broader economic systems of the period. The brutality of those systems is now well documented by historians. This creates a tension in how Drake is remembered. On one hand, he was a skilled navigator, an effective commander, and a central figure in a major geopolitical conflict. On the other hand, he operated within and contributed to systems of violence and exploitation that had lasting consequences across multiple continents. That duality is not unique to Drake, but it is particularly visible in his case, due to the scale of his fame. In the centuries following his death, his image continued to evolve. During the Elizabethan era and into the early Stuart period, he was often celebrated in literature and public discourse as a national hero. His exploits were retold in dramatic and sometimes exaggerated forms. The emphasis was placed on bravery, ingenuity, and success against overwhelming odds. Later periods interpreted him differently. In the Age of Empire, he was sometimes presented as a precursor to British naval dominance. In post-colonial historical analysis, greater attention has been given to the destructive impact of European expansion on indigenous populations and colonized societies. As a result, Drake's legacy now exists in multiple layers. He is not a single figure with a single meaning. He is a historical intersection, a point where exploration, commerce, warfare, and imperial expansion all converged. Even the places associated with him reflect this complexity. Ports in the Caribbean that once feared his raids are now historical sites studied by archaeologists and historians. The Pacific coastline he sailed along is now part of modern nation-states with their own distinct identities and historical narratives. And the global routes he followed are now well-established maritime corridors essential to international trade. In that sense, Drake's voyages belong to an early phase of globalization. A phase marked not by stability, but by competition, uncertainty, and rapid change. His circumnavigation did not create globalization by itself, but it demonstrated its possibility in practical terms. Ships could circle the world. Goods could move across oceans. Information could travel, however slowly, between continents. Power could be projected far beyond Europe's immediate borders. These realities would define the centuries that followed. As we step back from Drake's life, what remains is not a simple moral verdict, but a detailed historical portrait. A man shaped by his time, operating within the norms of his era, achieving extraordinary maritime feats, participating in systems that modern perspectives critically reassess, and ultimately becoming a symbol that different societies interpret in very different ways. The ocean that carried him around the world still carries ships today, but the meaning of his journeys continues to be debated, not because the facts are unclear, but because history itself is rarely experienced in only one way. And in that sense, Francis Drake remains exactly what he was in life. A figure seen differently, depending on where you stand. A figure seen differently, depending on where you stand. To understand why Francis Drake's story continues to generate debate, it helps to step away from personality and look at structure, specifically, the structure of the world he operated in. The 16th century was not organized around modern ideas of national borders, international law, or global commerce regulation. Instead, it was a fragmented system of competing empires, religious blocs, and emerging maritime powers. Spain and Portugal, through earlier treaties and papal agreements, claimed vast overseas territories. England, France, and the Dutch Republic were newer challengers trying to insert themselves into those global routes. In that environment, the sea was not a neutral space. It was contested territory. Control of shipping lanes, ports, and coastal access directly translated into political and economic power. Drake's career unfolded inside that competitive framework. He did not operate in isolation. His voyages were tied to broader strategic calculations made by English authorities under Queen Elizabeth I. Even when presented as private ventures, his expeditions often aligned with national interests, weakening Spanish maritime dominance, disrupting treasure flows, and testing the limits of English naval reach. From a technical perspective, Drake's activities fall into several overlapping categories used by historians. Exploration, his circumnavigation, and geographic observations. Privateering, legally sanctioned attacks on enemy shipping during periods of undeclared or partial war. Commerce raiding, targeting economic infrastructure such as treasure fleets and ports. Imperial expansion, early participation in the projection of English influence abroad. These categories are modern analytical tools. In Drake's own time, the boundaries between them were far less defined. A single voyage could include all four elements simultaneously. For example, during the Golden Hind expedition, Drake navigated and mapped unknown regions, captured Spanish shipping, seized and redistributed wealth, engaged in diplomacy with local rulers, claimed territory symbolically for England. Each of these actions fits a different historical category. Together, they form a single voyage. This blending of roles is one reason his legacy is difficult to simplify. Another factor is the asymmetry of historical records. English accounts of Drake's voyages were often written with national interest in mind. They emphasized success, ingenuity, and divine favor. Spanish accounts emphasized loss, destruction, and illegality. Indigenous perspectives in many regions he passed through are less extensively documented in surviving European records, which creates a gap in the historical narrative. Modern historians attempt to reconstruct a more balanced picture, but the limitations of source material inevitably shape interpretation. There is also the issue of scale versus visibility. Drake was not the only English privateer of his era, nor was he the only navigator to attempt global circumnavigation. Nor was he the only commander involved in Atlantic warfare. However, his combination of achievements placed him in a uniquely visible position. He completed a global circumnavigation successfully. He captured exceptionally valuable Spanish cargoes. He played a role in the defense against the Spanish Armada. He became directly associated with Queen Elizabeth I's reign. Visibility matters in history. Many figures perform similar roles, but only a few become symbols. Drake became one of those symbols because his life intersected with several major historical developments at once. 1. The rise of English maritime power. 2. The expansion of Atlantic trade networks. 3. The intensification of European imperial rivalry. 4. The development of early global navigation systems. Each of these processes would have continued without him, but his actions accelerated England's engagement with them. His circumnavigation, in particular, had long-term intellectual consequences. It contributed to improved understanding of global geography, ocean currents, and navigational possibilities. While not the first circumnavigation in history, it was among the earliest completed by an English expedition and therefore carried strong national significance. It also influenced how future expeditions were planned. After Drake, the idea that English ships could operate globally was no longer theoretical. It was demonstrated. That demonstration changed expectations. In the decades after his death, English maritime strategy increasingly emphasized long-range navigation, overseas trade expansion, naval raiding capacity, global intelligence. Gathering these elements would later become foundational in the development of the English, and eventually British, naval system. But it is important not to overstate continuity. Drake did not create the British Empire. He operated in an earlier, more experimental phase of overseas expansion, when outcomes were uncertain and institutions were still developing. His voyages were part of a learning process, sometimes successful, sometimes chaotic, always risky. There is also a human dimension, often lost in strategic summaries. Life aboard 16th century ships was physically and psychologically demanding. Crews endured prolonged isolation, a limited food variety, disease outbreaks, unpredictable weather, constant mechanical labor, uncertain survival outcomes. Drake, as commander, carried additional pressures. Maintaining discipline over extended voyages, managing political expectations from England, balancing profit motives with strategic objectives, responding to unpredictable conditions at sea and on land. These pressures help explain some of his most controversial decisions, including harsh disciplinary actions and aggressive tactics. They do not necessarily justify them, but they provide context for understanding how command functioned in that environment. The ocean itself was both a pathway and a barrier. It enabled global movement, but it also imposed severe constraints. Navigation errors could be fatal. Supply miscalculations could end entire expeditions. Weather systems could destroy years of planning in days. Drake's success depended not only on courage, but on accumulated maritime knowledge. Navigation skills, timing, route selection, and ship handling developed through repeated exposure to those conditions. This technical competence is often overshadowed by the more dramatic aspects of his career, but it was essential to his survival and success. Without it, his story would likely have ended early, like many of his contemporaries. Instead, it extended across decades and oceans. As we move toward the final stages of his life in the next section, the focus shifts from achievement to consequence. What remains after voyages end is not only fame or treasure, but historical impact. And in Drake's case, that impact continued long after his final ship left the harbor. And in Drake's case, that impact continued long after his final ship left the harbor. After his death in 1596, the immediate political and military context in which he had operated continued to evolve rapidly. England and Spain remained locked in prolonged conflict, but neither side achieved a decisive, permanent resolution in the short term. Instead, the struggle shifted across theaters: Atlantic, European, and colonial, taking on new forms as each power adapted. Drake's absence was felt most directly in operational terms. He had been one of England's most experienced commanders at sea, particularly in long-distance naval operations against Spanish holdings. His familiarity with Caribbean geography, Spanish shipping behavior, and logistical vulnerabilities had given English expeditions a distinct advantage in earlier campaigns. Without him, later English naval actions lacked one of their most recognizable and seasoned leaders. But the broader historical trajectory did not depend on a single individual. By the early 17th century, English maritime activity was expanding in new directions. Trading companies began to form with increasing regularity, most notably those focused on Asia and the Atlantic world. These organizations reflected a shift from primarily opportunistic raiding toward more structured commercial expansion. Drake's earlier voyages helped normalize the idea that English ships could operate on a global scale. That normalization mattered. It changed expectations among investors, political leaders, and sailors. What had once seemed extraordinary became, over time, increasingly routine. At the same time, Spain's imperial system continued to function, though under growing strain. The vast distances involved in governing American territories, combined with persistent military and financial pressures, made long-term stability difficult to maintain without constant effort. The rivalry between England and Spain gradually transformed from episodic conflict into a more sustained geopolitical competition. Naval power remained central to that competition. In this environment, Drake's earlier actions were frequently revisited, not as isolated events, but as precedents. The Cadiz raid, the circumnavigation, and the Caribbean expeditions were studied as examples of how a smaller maritime power could disrupt a larger imperial system through speed, intelligence, and targeted strikes. Military thinkers and naval planners drew lessons, sometimes explicitly, sometimes indirectly, from those earlier campaigns. However, the cultural memory of Drake did not remain stable. It evolved differently in different regions. In England, especially during the late Elizabethan and early Stuart periods, he was increasingly incorporated into a broader narrative of national emergence. He became part of a story about England's transition into a maritime-oriented state capable of global engagement. In Spain and Spanish America, memory followed a different path. There, Drake was associated with raids that caused material loss and psychological disruption. His name remained tied to fear, uncertainty, and the vulnerability of coastal settlements and shipping routes. These divergent memories persisted for centuries. Over time, historians began attempting to reconcile these perspectives by placing Drake within larger structural processes rather than treating him solely as a heroic or villainous figure. One of the key interpretive shifts in modern scholarship is the emphasis on systems rather than individuals. Drake is now often analyzed as a participant in early modern maritime warfare systems, emerging Atlantic economic networks, imperial competition between European powers, transitional forms of state-sponsored privateering. This does not remove his agency, but it situates it within broader patterns. It also highlights an important point. Many of the actions associated with Drake were not unique to him. They were part of a wider practice of state-aligned maritime aggression during a period when legal and moral frameworks governing the seas were still developing. Privateering commissions, for example, were common tools used by multiple European states. They blurred the line between war and commerce, allowing governments to project force without maintaining large permanent navies. Drake's effectiveness within this system made him notable, but not singular in method. What distinguishes him more clearly is the combination of three elements: geographic reach, operational success, symbolic elevation. Few contemporaries matched his combination of global navigation, high-value captures, and political visibility. The circumnavigation remains particularly significant in this regard. While earlier expeditions had completed global voyages under different flags, Drake's journey became especially influential in England because it demonstrated feasibility at a moment when English global expansion was still in its early stages. It functioned as proof of concept, a practical demonstration that English maritime capabilities could extend across multiple oceans, engage with diverse regions, and return successfully with valuable cargo. This demonstration had long-term consequences. It influenced ship design priorities, navigational training, and investment patterns. It also contributed to a gradual shift in how English political leadership viewed overseas engagement, not as rare exceptions, but as repeatable operations. Yet alongside this strategic legacy, there remains the more complex human legacy. Drake operated in a world where violence at sea was normalized among competing European powers. That normalization does not erase its impact on affected populations, but it does explain why such actions were widely practiced across multiple states. Modern ethical frameworks cannot be directly mapped onto 16th century political systems without distortion. At the same time, ignoring the consequences of those systems would be equally incomplete. This tension is central to any serious discussion of Drake. He is neither simply an emblem of national achievement nor merely a figure of condemnation. He is an example of how individuals can become deeply embedded in structural forces that extend beyond personal intent. As historical analysis has matured, the focus has shifted from asking whether Drake was good or bad, toward more precise questions. What systems enabled his actions? What consequences followed from them? How did different societies interpret those consequences? How did his voyages influence later developments in global maritime history? These questions produce a more accurate, if less emotionally simple, understanding. As we move into the final section of his story, the focus narrows again from systems back to the end of an individual life. Because regardless of historical interpretation, all such lives eventually reach the same point. The sea gives journeys. And eventually, it also takes them away. The sea gives journeys. And eventually, it also takes them away. In Drake's final expedition of 1595 to 1596, the contrast between expectation and outcome became increasingly visible as the voyage progressed. When the fleet left England, there was still a sense, at least among some participants, that decisive success was possible. Spanish America remained vast, and its coastal cities and shipping routes still represented valuable targets. Earlier generations of English privateers had demonstrated that Spanish holdings could be struck effectively with well-planned raids. However, the operational environment of the 1590s was no longer identical to that of Drake's earlier career. Spanish defensive systems had adapted. Intelligence networks were more developed. Colonial administrations had more experience responding to threats. The element of surprise, once a defining advantage for Drake, was now significantly reduced. As the fleet moved through the Atlantic, logistical difficulties began to accumulate. Supply constraints, coordination issues, and the physical toll of long-distance sailing created friction within the expedition. These problems were not unusual for the period, but they had a cumulative effect on operational effectiveness. When the expedition reached the Caribbean theater, Spanish preparedness became immediately apparent. Fortified ports were better defended than in earlier decades. Local militias responded more quickly. Warning systems improved communication between settlements. As a result, English attacks encountered stronger resistance and less strategic payoff. Drake's attempt to reassert dominance in the region faced structural limitations. The environment itself had changed. One of the most strategically important targets was San Juan in Puerto Rico. Control or disruption of this port could have provided leverage over regional Spanish shipping lanes. However, Spanish defensive positioning and prior intelligence awareness reduced the likelihood of a decisive breakthrough. The engagement did not produce the kind of rapid success that had characterized some of Drake's earlier Caribbean operations. Instead, the campaign became protracted and resource-intensive. Simultaneously, environmental conditions contributed to declining health among crews. Tropical disease remained one of the most persistent hazards in early modern naval warfare. Lack of understanding regarding transmission mechanisms, combined with limited medical treatment options, meant that outbreaks could spread quickly and persistently aboard ships. The fleet experienced growing attrition. This is a recurring feature in early modern maritime expeditions. Even when military outcomes were uncertain, biological conditions often had decisive effects on campaign viability. Within this context, the personal dimension of Drake's final voyage becomes more prominent. He was no longer the highly mobile, rapidly adaptive commander of the 1570s and 1580s. Age, accumulated exposure to harsh environments, and repeated stress from decades of maritime activity had taken a measurable toll. While historical sources are limited in clinical detail, the general pattern suggests progressive weakening during the campaign. Leadership at sea in this period required constant decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Even minor impairments in health could significantly affect operational capacity, given the complexity of navigation, coordination, and command responsibilities. As the expedition continued, Spanish resistance remained consistent, and English gains remained limited relative to expectations. The campaign gradually shifted from offensive initiative toward attempted consolidation of partial objectives. This shift is important analytically. Drake's earlier successes often relied on rapid strikes against underprepared targets. In contrast, this expedition increasingly involved sustained pressure against prepared defenses, an environment in which his traditional advantages were less effective. By late 1595 and early 1596, the expedition's momentum had weakened significantly. Disease continued to spread. Supply conditions remained strained. Strategic objectives were only partially achieved. It is within this deteriorating operational context that Drake's final illness developed. Most historical accounts identify dysentery, or a related gastrointestinal infection, as the likely cause of death. In the 16th century, such conditions were common in tropical naval environments and often fatal, particularly without sustained recovery conditions or effective medical intervention. The physiological effects would have been severe: dehydration, weakness, and progressive systemic decline. Despite his condition, Drake remained within the operational environment of the fleet until the final stages of his life. This reflects both the expectations of command at the time and the lack of viable alternatives for evacuation or long-term treatment at sea. On January 28, 1596, near the Isthmus of Panama, Francis Drake died aboard ship. His death occurred in the same general region that had shaped some of his earliest major successes in the Caribbean theater. There is a symbolic symmetry in this geographic return, though it is not evidence of intention. Rather, it reflects the cyclical nature of his operational history in the region. Following his death, standard maritime burial procedures of the period were followed. His body was placed in a lead-lined coffin and committed to the sea. This method was both practical and symbolic, reflecting the realities of naval life, where long-distance transport of remains was often impossible. The exact burial location remains unknown. That uncertainty is itself characteristic of many early modern maritime histories, where documentation was incomplete and physical markers were intentionally minimal. News of Drake's death spread unevenly across the Atlantic world. In England, it marked the end of a prominent naval figure whose career had been closely tied to national maritime development. In Spain, reactions were shaped by long-standing conflict narratives in which Drake had been viewed as a persistent adversary. In both cases, his death did not end his historical presence. Instead, it initiated a transition from active figure to interpreted legacy. And that legacy would continue to expand far beyond the circumstances of his final voyage. And that legacy would continue to expand far beyond the circumstances of his final voyage. After Drake's death, the early 17th century inherited not just the memory of a man, but the operational patterns of an era he had helped define. England's maritime activities did not pause. Instead, they increasingly evolved into more structured forms of overseas engagement. The informal, highly flexible privateering culture of the Elizabethan period began to transition into more institutionalized systems of trade and naval power. Joint stock companies, formalized charters, and expanding administrative frameworks gradually replaced the earlier reliance on individually commissioned expeditions. Yet Drake's influence remained embedded in the mindset of English maritime practice. The idea that naval power could be projected aggressively across long distances had been demonstrated repeatedly during his career. That demonstration did not guarantee success in every case, but it established a conceptual foundation. England could act beyond its immediate coastline in ways that meaningfully affected global rivals. Spain, meanwhile, continued to manage its vast empire through an increasingly complex balance of military defense, administrative oversight, and maritime logistics. The system remained powerful, but it was also under persistent strain due to its scale and the demands of continuous transoceanic coordination. In this environment, Drake's earlier actions were often studied indirectly as case examples of maritime disruption. English strategists and seafarers observed that targeted attacks on shipping routes and ports could yield disproportionate strategic effects compared to territorial conquest alone. This insight influenced later naval thinking, even as technologies and political conditions evolved. Over time, however, Drake's historical identity became increasingly layered and sometimes contradictory. In English cultural memory, especially during periods of heightened national maritime ambition, he was frequently presented as a pioneering figure of naval excellence. His circumnavigation was emphasized as a defining achievement, and his role in resisting the Spanish Armada was framed as a foundational moment in national survival and identity. In Spanish and many Latin American historical traditions, the emphasis remained different. Accounts of raids, port attacks, and disruptions to colonial shipping continued to shape his reputation as an aggressive privateer whose actions had tangible negative impacts on communities and economies. These divergent interpretations are not merely historical disagreements. They reflect the broader reality that imperial expansion and maritime conflict were experienced differently depending on geographic and political position. Modern historiography tends to approach Drake through a more analytical framework, focusing on structure rather than simple moral categorization. Several key themes recur in scholarly discussion. First, the nature of state-sanctioned privateering. Drake's activities were not purely personal ventures. They operated under formal or informal authorization from the English crown, which complicates attempts to classify him strictly as either pirate or naval officer in modern terms. Second, the economics of maritime warfare. His expeditions were deeply tied to the extraction and redistribution of wealth across global routes, particularly in relation to Spanish-American treasure systems. These operations demonstrated how economic pressure could be applied through naval mobility. Third, the technological and navigational dimension. Drake's circumnavigation contributed to practical knowledge about oceanic routes, winds, currents, and the logistical requirements of sustained global travel. Fourth, the cultural and ideological impact. His voyages contributed to emerging narratives of English maritime capability and global presence, which would later become more fully developed in subsequent centuries. Taken together, these themes place Drake within a transitional historical moment, the shift from localized European power struggles toward early forms of global maritime competition. However, it is equally important to recognize what Drake's legacy does not represent. He was not the origin of global exploration. He was not the sole driver of English maritime expansion. He was not operating in a vacuum of invention or discovery. Instead, he was part of a broader network of sailors, financiers, political actors, and rival empires all participating in an expanding and increasingly interconnected world system. His prominence comes from his position within that system, not outside it. As time progressed, the symbolic weight of his name continued to grow beyond the specific details of his life. Monuments, literature, and historical accounts often emphasized selected aspects of his career while minimizing others. This selective memory is common in historical figures associated with national identity formation. In Drake's case, the circumnavigation and the Armada campaign became particularly dominant in popular memory, while the more complex and ethically difficult aspects of his involvement in early Atlantic systems received varying degrees of attention depending on the historical period and cultural context. This unevenness is itself part of his legacy. It illustrates how historical memory is shaped not only by events, but by later interpretation. By the time England had fully transitioned into a global maritime power in later centuries, Drake was often retrospectively positioned as an early exemplar of that trajectory. Yet historians caution against reading later outcomes backward into his life. The world of the 1570s, 1590s was not yet the world of formalized empires and global industrial systems. It was a period of experimentation, uncertainty, and rapidly changing geopolitical conditions. Drake operated within that uncertainty, adapting to circumstances as they evolved. His success depended on flexibility as much as planning, on risk as much as structure, on opportunity as much as strategy. As we move toward the final part of his story, the focus shifts from historical interpretation back to the human scale of his journey's conclusion. Because beyond debates of legacy and analysis, there remains a simple fact. A life spent crossing oceans eventually ends at sea. And for Francis Drake, that ending came far from home, in waters that had defined nearly every chapter of his existence. And for Francis Drake, that ending came far from home, in waters that had defined nearly every chapter of his existence. The final days of Drake's life are not recorded with the same narrative clarity as his most famous voyages. Early modern naval documentation often focused on strategic outcomes rather than detailed personal medical accounts, especially during ongoing military operations. What is clear is that by early 1596, the expedition he commanded had reached a point of operational exhaustion. The combination of disease, limited strategic success, and sustained resistance had placed significant strain on both leadership and crew. Drake himself was no longer able to maintain the level of active command that had characterized his earlier career. Decision-making responsibilities increasingly depended on delegation, and the tempo of operations slowed accordingly. In practical terms, 16th century naval expeditions did not have a clean separation between combat, logistics, and healthcare. All three existed simultaneously within the same constrained environment aboard ship. When illness affected leadership, it had immediate consequences for coordination and morale. Drake's condition deteriorated in this context. Dysentery, the most commonly cited cause, was particularly dangerous in tropical maritime environments due to dehydration, malnutrition, and the absence of effective rehydration treatments. Once advanced, recovery was unlikely without substantial rest and medical intervention, conditions rarely available during active naval campaigns. As his condition worsened, the expedition continued to operate in a reduced capacity. Spanish forces in the region remained active, and English ships were still engaged in limited movements along the coastline, but the campaign had already lost much of its earlier strategic coherence. On January 28, 1596, Francis Drake died aboard ship near the Isthmus of Panama. His death did not occur in battle, nor during a climactic naval engagement, but within the slow collapse of health that often characterized maritime fatalities in the early modern period. The timing is significant in a historical sense. Drake died not at the moment of triumph or defeat, but at the end of a prolonged operational struggle in a theater that had defined much of his career. The Caribbean and surrounding waters were both the setting of his earliest successes and the stage of his final expedition. After his death, the immediate priority for the crew was procedural. Maritime burial practices of the period were shaped by necessity. Long-distance preservation and transport of bodies were not feasible under most conditions at sea. Drake's body was placed in a lead-lined coffin, a common method intended to provide containment and facilitate a respectful maritime burial. The coffin was then committed to the sea, reportedly near Portobello. There was no marked grave on land, no permanent physical monument at the site of his death. Instead, his final resting place became part of the same ocean system that had carried him across the globe decades earlier. The symbolism is difficult to ignore, even if it should not be overstated. A life defined by maritime movement, concluding in maritime burial, reflects the structural reality of seafaring existence in the 16th century. Ships were both workplaces and living spaces, but they were not designed for permanent closure or commemoration in the way land-based institutions often are. News of Drake's death spread gradually. Communication across the Atlantic world remained slow and fragmented. Reports moved through ships, ports, and official correspondence before reaching broader public awareness. In England, the reaction was shaped by his established reputation. Drake had already become a figure of national significance during his lifetime. His death therefore functioned less as a discovery and more as a confirmation of loss. In Spain, where he had long been regarded as an adversary, the news was interpreted through the lens of ongoing conflict. His removal from active command altered the strategic landscape, but did not end the underlying rivalry between the two empires. What followed in the longer term was not resolution, but reinterpretation. Drake's life began to transition from historical event to historical narrative. This transition is important. Historical narratives are not fixed records. They are constructed over time through repetition, emphasis, omission, and reinterpretation. In England, early commemorations tended to emphasize The circumnavigation as proof of national capability. The defeat of the Armada as a defining defensive victory. The expansion of English maritime presence. In Spanish accounts and colonial memory, emphasis often remained on disruption of trade routes, attacks on coastal settlements, a loss of ships and cargo, instability introduced into established systems. Neither perspective is purely fictional. Both are grounded in real consequences experienced by different communities. Over time, historians have worked to place these perspectives into a shared analytical frame. That frame does not erase disagreement, but it clarifies structure. Drake emerges not as a singular moral category, but as a node within larger historical processes. Early modern naval warfare. Imperial competition in the Atlantic and Pacific. The emergence of global navigation systems. The transformation of maritime commerce. In that sense, his death marks not an endpoint, but a transition in how his actions are understood. The physical journey ended. The interpretive journey began. And like many figures from his era, Francis Drake now exists less as a single narrative and more as a collection of overlapping histories, each emphasizing different aspects of the same life. As we move into the final section, the focus will shift fully from biography to legacy. Not what he did moment by moment, but what those actions became over time. Not what he did moment by moment, but what those actions became over time. In the decades following Drake's death, England itself continued to change at a rapid pace. The transition from Elizabeth I's reign into the Stuart period brought shifts in political structure, religious tension, and overseas ambition. Maritime activity, however, remained a constant and expanding feature of English national development. Drake's earlier voyages were repeatedly revisited in this evolving context. They functioned as reference points, historical examples used to illustrate what English seafaring could achieve under favorable conditions. The circumnavigation in particular gained a lasting place in navigational and cultural memory. It was not only a maritime achievement, but also a conceptual one. It demonstrated that global travel was possible within the constraints of early modern technology, sail-powered ships, rudimentary cartography, celestial navigation, and extended provisioning systems. That demonstration influenced later expeditions indirectly by reshaping expectations. What had once been considered exceptional gradually became thinkable as a repeatable endeavor. At the same time, English maritime strategy continued to evolve away from purely opportunistic privateering toward more structured forms of naval and commercial organization. Trading corporations and charter companies began to play an increasingly important role in overseas expansion. This transition did not eliminate privateering entirely, but it reframed it within broader institutional frameworks. Drake's career, which had operated at the intersection of state authorization and individual initiative, can be seen as part of the earlier phase of this transformation. As England's global presence expanded in later centuries, Drake's image was increasingly incorporated into national narratives of maritime origin. In these narratives, he was often positioned alongside other figures associated with exploration and naval development. However, the process of historical elevation also involved simplification. Complex aspects of his career were sometimes reduced or omitted in popular accounts. This is a common feature of national historical memory, where certain figures become symbolic representations rather than fully contextualized individuals. At the same time, counter-narratives persisted and expanded. In Spanish and Latin American historical traditions, Drake remained associated with the disruptions caused by English maritime raids during the late 16th century. These accounts emphasized the lived experience of coastal communities, colonial administrators, and maritime merchants who faced direct consequences from privateering activity. Modern historiography attempts to integrate these perspectives rather than privileging one over the other. This integration relies on several methodological principles. First, distinguishing between description and evaluation. Historical analysis separates what occurred from how it is interpreted morally or politically. Second, situating individual actions within structural systems. Drake's voyages are examined in relation to imperial competition, economic incentives, and technological constraints. Third, acknowledging source asymmetry. Surviving documentation is unevenly distributed across regions and perspectives, which shapes reconstruction. Within this framework, Drake is understood less as an isolated figure and more as a participant in early globalization processes. The term globalization in this context does not refer to modern economic integration, but to the initial phase of sustained intercontinental connectivity driven by maritime expansion. His circumnavigation, combined with Pacific and Atlantic operations, illustrates how European powers began to operate within a genuinely global spatial framework for the first time in recorded history. However, this global system was not neutral in its development. It was shaped by competition, coercion, and unequal power relations between states and between European and non-European societies. Drake's activities contributed to that system through disruption of existing Spanish maritime logistics, extraction of wealth from colonial routes, mapping and navigation of previously less documented regions, demonstration of long-range naval capability. These contributions had consequences beyond England and Spain. They affected trade patterns, regional stability in certain coastal zones, and the evolving balance of maritime power. It is also important to note the technological constraints of the period. 16th century navigation relied on tools such as astrolabes and cross staffs, dead reckoning, rudimentary charts and pilot books, observational astronomy. Accuracy was limited, and cumulative errors were common over long distances. Successful circumnavigation required not only skill but also adaptation to uncertainty. Drake's ability to manage these constraints contributed significantly to the success of his voyage. Yet, even this technical achievement is inseparable from its broader context of maritime conflict and economic competition. As centuries passed, Drake's legacy continued to be reinterpreted according to the needs and perspectives of different eras. In the 19th century, during periods of imperial expansion, he was often framed as a precursor to British naval dominance. In later academic traditions, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, his legacy became more critically examined within frameworks of empire, colonialism, and global inequality. These shifts do not indicate that the historical facts changed, but that interpretive priorities did. History is not static memory, it is active reconstruction. Drake's life is a particularly clear example of this process because it intersects so many domains: exploration, warfare, commerce, state formation, cultural identity. Few individuals occupy so many overlapping categories within early modern history. As a result, his biography resists simple classification. This resistance is itself historically meaningful. It reflects the complexity of the world in which he lived, a world undergoing rapid transformation, where the boundaries between legal and illegal, exploration and conquest, trade and plunder were still being negotiated. As we move into the final section, the focus will shift from interpretation back to reflection. Because beyond all analysis, categorization, and debate, there remains the enduring image of a ship moving across open water, and a man whose life was defined by never staying in one place for long. When historians examine Francis Drake's career in full, one of the most striking features is the consistency of movement. Unlike many figures whose influence is tied to a single region or a single event, Drake's activities spanned multiple oceans, continents, and political theaters. This geographic range is not incidental. It reflects the nature of early modern maritime expansion, where mobility itself was a form of power. To move faster, farther, and more unpredictably than an opponent was often more valuable than direct confrontation. Drake's success repeatedly depended on this principle. Whether in the Caribbean, the Pacific, or along the coasts of Europe and Africa, his expeditions leveraged speed, surprise, and knowledge of sea routes. However, mobility also came with costs. Sustained long-distance travel exposed crews to prolonged stress, environmental hazards, and logistical instability. Ships of the period were not designed for continuous global operation without significant risk. Every voyage required balancing ambition with survivability. In Drake's circumnavigation, that balance was stretched to its limits. The expedition succeeded, but only through a combination of careful navigation, opportunistic decision-making, and considerable fortune in surviving storms and separation events. From a systems perspective, his voyages illustrate early experimentation with global operational logistics. Key components included provisioning for multi-year voyages, adapting to unfamiliar climates and disease environments, maintaining crew cohesion over long durations, responding dynamically to shifting political and military conditions. These elements would later become foundational in more formalized naval and commercial systems. But in Drake's era, they were still being learned through direct experience. There is also a psychological dimension often noted by maritime historians. Extended sea voyages in the 16th century created conditions of extreme isolation. Communication with home nations was effectively non-existent once ships left major ports. Decisions made at sea had to be autonomous, often without external oversight or immediate reinforcement. Commanders like Drake therefore operated with a high degree of discretionary authority. This autonomy contributed to both effectiveness and controversy. On one hand, it allowed rapid decision-making in unpredictable conditions. On the other, it created space for actions that would later be interpreted differently depending on legal, political, or moral frameworks. Drake's execution of Thomas Doughty during the circumnavigation is frequently cited in this context. It illustrates the tension between naval discipline and legal procedure in remote operational environments. Such incidents highlight a broader structural reality of the period. Maritime authority often functioned outside the immediate reach of standardized legal institutions. This does not make it lawless in a modern sense, but it does indicate a different configuration of governance at sea. Another important dimension of Drake's legacy is his relationship with information. In the 16th century, geographic and navigational knowledge was a strategic asset. Maps were incomplete. Sea routes were partially documented. Coastal information was often closely guarded. Drake's voyages contributed to the accumulation and circulation of such knowledge within English maritime networks. This included awareness of Spanish shipping routes and timing patterns, identification of navigable passages and coastal hazards, experiential data on winds, currents, and seasonal conditions, observations of ports, settlements, and logistical nodes. Some of this information was directly exploited for economic and military advantage. Other portions became part of broader navigational understanding used by later explorers. However, it is important to recognize that knowledge in this period was not freely shared in modern terms. It was often treated as proprietary or strategically sensitive. Access to information could determine commercial success or military advantage. Drake operated within that informational economy. His voyages both consumed and produced strategic knowledge. Over time, this contributed to England's growing participation in global maritime systems. But again, these developments must be understood as incremental rather than instantaneous. Drake did not create English naval dominance. He participated in an early phase of its formation. As we move toward the concluding section of this narrative, it becomes necessary to shift focus from operational history to historical interpretation itself. Because the way Drake is remembered today tells us as much about later societies as it does about the 16th century. In different periods, his image has been adapted to serve different explanatory needs. In some eras, he represents national emergence. In others, imperial aggression. In still others, a transitional figure in global maritime history. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. They reflect different analytical priorities applied to the same historical data. What remains consistent across all interpretations is the recognition that Drake's life intersected with major structural transformations. The expansion of European oceanic exploration, the consolidation of early modern states, the intensification of imperial competition, the formation of global trade networks. These transformations would have occurred with or without him, but his actions influenced their specific trajectory within English history. As a result, Drake occupies a position that is both specific and symbolic. Specific, in the sense that his documented voyages and actions are historically verifiable. Symbolic, in the sense that later generations have used his story to represent broader themes of exploration, conflict, and national identity. This duality is central to understanding why his name continues to appear in historical discussion. Not because his life is singularly unique in every respect, but because it sits at the intersection of multiple large-scale historical processes. And in that intersection, individual biography becomes inseparable from global history. As the narrative approaches its final segment, the focus will narrow once more from systems and interpretation back to the closing arc of remembrance. Because even after centuries of analysis, the fundamental outline remains unchanged. A sailor from England who crossed the world and returned as a figure remembered far beyond his lifetime. As Drake's legacy moved further into the 17th century, the world around his memory continued to reorganize itself. England's maritime activity expanded steadily, shifting from occasional long-distance ventures into more sustained commercial and naval presence abroad. This transition was gradual, shaped by economic necessity, political competition, and technological refinement. Drake's earlier voyages were frequently cited, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, as examples of what had already been accomplished. In practical terms, his expeditions had demonstrated that extended oceanic travel could be organized, financed, and completed with sufficient planning and skill. This demonstration mattered. It lowered the psychological barrier to future expansion. It also contributed to an evolving sense that the ocean was not an end point, but a pathway. At the same time, Spain's imperial system continued to function as a major global structure, even as it faced mounting pressures. Maintaining control over vast territories required constant maritime coordination, administrative oversight, and military expenditure. In this context, Drake's actions were remembered differently depending on perspective. In English historical tradition, particularly as narratives of national identity developed, Drake's name became associated with resilience and maritime capability. The defeat of the Spanish Armada remained a central reference point, often used to symbolize national survival in the face of overwhelming opposition. In Spanish and colonial records, however, emphasis remained on disruption. Coastal raids, intercepted shipping, and attacks on port cities were not abstract achievements, but lived events with material consequences. These contrasting memories persisted across generations, shaping how Drake was written about, taught, and interpreted. By the time historical writing became more formalized in later centuries, especially with the rise of academic historiography, scholars began to approach figures like Drake through more systematic frameworks. Rather than relying solely on national narrative traditions, historians began analyzing economic incentives behind maritime expeditions, political authorization mechanisms such as privateering commissions, technological constraints of navigation and shipbuilding, comparative imperial strategies among European powers. Within these frameworks, Drake is understood less as an isolated, heroic, or villainous figure and more as a representative participant in early modern maritime systems. One key analytical shift involves the concept of state involvement. Drake's activities cannot be cleanly separated from English governmental interests. Even when operating under private commission, his expeditions aligned with broader strategic goals of weakening Spanish maritime dominance and expanding English influence. This complicates any attempt to classify his actions purely as private enterprise. Similarly, the economic dimension of his voyages is essential to understanding their impact. The capture of Spanish cargoes, disruption of shipping routes, and extraction of wealth were not incidental outcomes. They were central objectives within the logic of privateering warfare. At the same time, these actions existed within a period when maritime conflict was widely practiced by multiple European powers. England was not unique in using privateers. Spain, France, and others employed similar methods under different legal frameworks. This broader context does not neutralize the consequences of those actions, but it does situate them within a competitive international system rather than a one-sided anomaly. Another important dimension of Drake's legacy is technological and navigational. The circumnavigation of the globe required sustained application of early modern navigational methods under extreme conditions. Celestial navigation, dead reckoning, and observational adaptation were all essential tools. The voyage contributed to a growing body of practical maritime knowledge that would later inform more systematic approaches to global navigation. However, it is important to avoid overstating this as a purely scientific enterprise. The expedition was simultaneously exploratory, commercial, and military in nature. These functions were not separated in the way modern institutional structures often are. They coexisted within a single voyage. That blending of purposes is characteristic of the period. As English maritime expansion continued into the 17th and 18th centuries, the institutional environment gradually changed. Joint stock companies, formal naval structures, and state-sponsored exploration programs became more prominent. Drake's era represents an earlier stage in this evolution, one defined by a higher degree of individual initiative operating within loosely structured state authorization. Over time, his image was increasingly incorporated into broader national narratives. In literature, education, and commemorative culture, he was often portrayed as a foundational figure in England's emergence as a maritime power. This portrayal emphasized select aspects of his career, while simplifying others. Such simplification is a common feature of historical memory formation. Complex individuals are often distilled into representative symbols that serve broader cultural or political purposes. At the same time, more critical historical perspectives continued to develop, particularly as global historical scholarship expanded in scope. These perspectives emphasize the impact of European maritime expansion on indigenous and colonial societies, the role of violence and coercion in early modern trade systems, the economic structures underlying privateering and exploration, the uneven distribution of historical narratives across regions. Within this framework, Drake is neither removed from historical significance nor elevated into singular importance. Instead, he is analyzed as part of a larger system of interconnected developments that shaped the early modern world. This dual approach, recognizing both agency and structure, is central to contemporary historical method. It allows for a more precise understanding of how individual actions interact with broader systemic forces. As we move into the final segment of this narrative, the focus shifts toward synthesis. Not resolution in a moral sense, but integration of perspective, all layered across centuries of historical understanding. When we step back from the accumulated narratives surrounding Francis Drake, what becomes most apparent is not a single defining trait, but a persistent pattern of reinterpretation. Each historical period has reshaped his image to fit its own priorities, concerns, and intellectual frameworks. In the immediate decades after his death, Drake was still a relatively recent figure in living memory. His voyages were not abstract history yet. They were recalled by sailors, merchants, and officials who had either participated in or directly witnessed the events of his era. In that context, his reputation was grounded in first-hand recollection and contemporary documentation. As time passed, however, memory shifted from lived experience to recorded narrative. Chronicles, maritime logs, letters, and early printed histories became the primary sources through which his life was understood. These sources were never neutral. They reflected the political and cultural environments in which they were produced. English accounts tended to emphasize coherence and success. Spanish accounts emphasized disruption and loss. Neither was comprehensive on its own, but together they reveal the dual nature of Drake's historical footprint. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as global maritime empires expanded significantly, Drake's story was increasingly integrated into national historical education. He was often presented as an early exemplar of naval strength and exploratory ambition. This period saw the consolidation of what might be called a heroic maritime narrative, in which exploration, naval conflict, and imperial expansion were framed as stages in a coherent national progression. Within that narrative, Drake occupied a foundational position. However, later historiographical developments in the 20th and 21st centuries introduced more critical and multi-perspective approaches. These approaches re-examined early modern maritime history with greater attention to the economic systems underpinning exploration and privateering, the role of coercion and violence in imperial expansion, the experiences of non-European societies affected by European naval activity, the structural inequalities embedded in global trade formation. Within this framework, Drake is no longer treated as a simple emblem of national achievement, but as a historically situated actor within a complex system of global transformation. This shift does not diminish his historical importance. Instead, it refines it. It allows his career to be understood in terms of interaction rather than isolation. Interaction between individual agency and state policy, maritime technology and environmental constraint, economic ambition and geopolitical rivalry, local encounters and global systems. One of the most important outcomes of this interpretive shift is a more precise understanding of causality. Drake did not single-handedly create English maritime expansion, nor did he independently shape the course of Anglo-Spanish relations. Instead, his actions operated within pre-existing tensions and contributed to their development in specific ways. For example, the circumnavigation demonstrated feasibility, but did not establish permanent trade routes. The Caribbean raids disrupted Spanish logistics, but did not dismantle imperial infrastructure. The Armada campaign contributed to English defensive confidence, but did not end the broader conflict between the two powers. Each outcome was partial, contingent, and embedded in larger systems. This perspective is essential for avoiding oversimplified historical conclusions. Another important aspect of Drake's legacy is methodological, how historians use his life as a case study. His career is frequently employed to illustrate early modern maritime systems because it contains a rare combination of a long-distance exploration, a naval warfare participation, economic extraction activities, direct involvement in major geopolitical events. This makes his biography unusually rich for analytical purposes. However, it also requires caution, because the density of documentation and narrative attention can create the illusion that his importance is greater in isolation than it actually was within broader historical processes. In reality, Drake was one participant among many in a rapidly expanding network of maritime actors. Sailors, merchants, navigators, financiers, and political leaders collectively shaped the system in which he operated. His prominence arises from visibility and documentation, not exclusivity of role. As modern historical scholarship continues to evolve, there is increasing emphasis on integrating multiple perspectives into a unified but non-reductive framework. This means acknowledging English national narratives without accepting them as complete, Spanish colonial accounts without treating them as singular authority, archaeological and environmental evidence where available, comparative analysis across European maritime powers. The goal is not to choose a single correct version of Drake's life, but to understand how different versions emerged and why they persist. In this sense, Drake's legacy is not static. It is continuously reconstructed. Even today, discussions about him often reflect contemporary concerns, debates about empire and colonial history, questions of historical commemoration and public memory, reassessments of national identity narratives, broader efforts to contextualize early globalization. These discussions demonstrate that historical figures remain active within cultural discourse long after their deaths. They are not only subjects of study, but also instruments through which societies examine their own past. As we approach the final section of this narrative, the focus shifts toward closure, not as simplification, but as synthesis. Because after centuries of interpretation, what remains is a layered historical figure, neither fully contained by praise nor by critique, but defined by the world he moved through, and the world that continued moving after him, and the world that continued moving after him. When Francis Drake's life is placed within the wider chronology of early modern history, his death in 1596 sits at a transitional point rather than a conclusion. The late 16th century was already giving way to a new phase of maritime organization, imperial competition, and global economic integration. England, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and other European powers were entering an era in which naval capacity and overseas commerce would become increasingly systematized. The ad hoc nature of earlier privateering expeditions gradually gave way to more formalized state and corporate structures. In that shift, Drake's career functioned as a reference point from a previous operational model. He belonged to a generation in which Individual commanders exercised wide discretionary authority. State authorization was flexible and situational. Naval warfare often blurred with commercial activity. Long-distance expeditions combined multiple objectives in a single voyage. By contrast, the emerging 17th century system began to separate these functions more clearly. Naval forces became more institutionalized. Trade was increasingly handled through chartered organizations. Exploration began to develop its own specialized frameworks. Drake's life, therefore, represents a kind of historical boundary condition. Not fully medieval in structure, not yet modern in organization, but transitional in nature. One of the most significant long-term outcomes of the period in which he operated was the normalization of sustained oceanic presence by European powers. Before the mid-16th century, global voyages were exceptional undertakings. After this period, they became progressively more routine for certain states and commercial entities. Drake's circumnavigation contributed to this normalization, not by making global travel easy, but by demonstrating that it was achievable within existing technological limits. That distinction is important. Achievement does not imply simplicity. It implies possibility under constraint. In parallel, the geopolitical consequences of Anglo-Spanish rivalry continued well beyond Drake's lifetime. The conflict between the two powers gradually evolved in intensity and form, eventually intersecting with broader European wars, religious tensions, and colonial competition. The maritime dimension remained central throughout. Control of sea routes, shipping protection, and naval projection of power became increasingly critical to national strategy. Drake's earlier raids and expeditions were often retrospectively analyzed in military contexts as examples of asymmetric maritime warfare, where smaller or less resource-rich powers could still exert meaningful pressure on larger empires through targeted disruption. This concept would later become a recurring theme in naval strategic thought. However, historical analysis also emphasizes the limits of such tactics. While raids and privateering could cause significant disruption, they rarely replace the need for sustained naval infrastructure and institutional capacity. Drake's successes occurred within a specific historical window in which such methods were particularly effective. As systems evolved, the balance between individual initiative and institutional scale shifted. Another dimension of Drake's legacy concerns cultural transmission. His voyages were recorded, retold, and reinterpreted across multiple media forms: written chronicles and maritime logs, printed pamphlets and early histories, oral storytelling among sailors and port communities, later literary and educational works. Each form of transmission introduced variation in emphasis, detail, and interpretation. This is a key reason why Drake's image is so variable across time. He is not preserved in a single fixed narrative, but in multiple overlapping narrative traditions. From a historiographical standpoint, this makes him particularly valuable for studying how historical memory is constructed. His life functions as a case study in selective emphasis in source material, a national framing of historical events, transformation of individuals into symbols, a long-term evolution of reputation. In modern academic contexts, Drake is frequently analyzed alongside other figures of early modern maritime expansion, allowing for comparative assessment. Such comparisons help clarify what aspects of his career were typical of the period and what aspects were relatively distinctive. Typical elements include engagement in privateering under state authorization, participation in Atlantic and Pacific exploration, involvement in imperial competition between European powers, reliance on emerging navigational technologies. More distinctive elements include successful circumnavigation completed under English command, sustained operational impact on Spanish maritime logistics, a high-profile association with major defensive events such as the Armada Campaign, unusually prominent posthumous, symbolic status in English historical identity. These distinctions help situate him accurately within his historical environment. As we move toward the concluding portion of this narrative, it becomes necessary to return to the fundamental interpretive tension that has accompanied Drake's story from the beginning. That tension is between a lived historical action and later historical meaning. Drake's life occurred in a specific material world of ships, storms, conflict, and commerce. His legacy exists in a different domain, the interpretive world of memory, analysis, and cultural narrative. Both are real, but they operate on different levels. Understanding Francis Drake requires holding both levels simultaneously without collapsing one into the other. And it is within that dual structure that his historical significance continues to persist. Not as a single definition, but as an evolving point of reference within the history of global maritime transformation. Not as a single definition, but as an evolving point of reference within the history of global maritime transformation. As historical scholarship continues to refine its understanding of the early modern period, Francis Drake is increasingly placed within broader comparative frameworks that include multiple actors across different maritime regions. This approach reduces emphasis on individual exceptionalism and increases focus on structural interaction. In practical terms, this means examining Drake alongside other English privateers operating under Elizabethan authority, Spanish naval commanders defending imperial shipping networks, Portuguese navigators engaged in established Atlantic and Indian Ocean routes, emerging Dutch maritime forces entering global trade competition. Within this wider field, Drake becomes one node among many within a dense and rapidly changing network of maritime activity. This does not diminish the significance of his actions, but it recalibrates their scale relative to the system in which they occurred. One of the key analytical outcomes of this approach is a clearer understanding of maritime interdependence. No single actor controlled the oceans during this period. Instead, power was distributed across shifting alliances, rivalries, and logistical capabilities. Shipping routes were influenced by seasonal wind patterns, naval patrol coverage, port infrastructure capacity, political conflict zones, economic incentives for trade and raiding. Drake's expeditions interacted with all of these variables, sometimes successfully exploiting them, other times being constrained by them. For example, his ability to disrupt Spanish shipping depended not only on his own tactics, but also on the timing of treasure fleets, the readiness of Spanish escorts, and the availability of English naval resources. Similarly, his circumnavigation relied on environmental knowledge of winds and currents that had been partially developed by earlier navigators, even if not yet fully systematized in European cartography. This highlights an important principle in historical analysis. Outcomes are rarely the result of isolated agency. They emerge from the interaction between human decision-making and environmental, technological, and institutional constraints. Another aspect of Drake's legacy concerns the development of maritime risk management. Early modern expeditions were inherently high-risk enterprises. Investors, sponsors, and participants faced significant uncertainty regarding survival rates of crews, success of cargo acquisition, navigational accuracy, political consequences of engagement with rival powers, environmental hazards such as storms and disease. Drake's voyages demonstrated both the potential rewards and the substantial risks involved in such undertakings. The capture of Spanish treasure represented extraordinary profit potential, but the losses due to weather, conflict, and illness were equally significant in many expeditions. Over time, this duality contributed to the evolution of more structured financial mechanisms for overseas ventures. Joint stock companies, insurance practices, and more formalized investment frameworks gradually emerged as responses to these uncertainties. While Drake himself did not design these systems, his expeditions existed within the same economic environment that produced them. His career therefore intersects with the early development of what would later become global commercial capitalism. However, it is important to avoid overly linear interpretations. The transition from privateering-based expeditions to corporate trade networks was not immediate or uniform. Both systems coexisted for extended periods, and maritime activity often blended elements of both. Drake's career sits precisely within that overlap. Another important dimension is environmental history. Modern scholarship increasingly considers the ecological impact of early modern maritime expansion. Ships introduced new patterns of resource extraction, introduced biological exchange between regions, and altered coastal economies in various ways. While Drake's voyages were not the sole driver of these changes, They were part of the broader process of increased intercontinental connectivity. This includes movement of goods such as spices, metals, and textiles, unintended transfer of biological organisms across oceans, increased pressure on certain coastal resource systems, expansion of maritime infrastructure in key port regions. These developments contributed to long-term global ecological transformation. In this sense, Drake's legacy extends beyond political and military history into environmental and economic history as well. As historical interpretation continues to evolve, there is also increasing attention to the concept of entangled histories. This approach emphasizes that European maritime expansion cannot be understood solely from the perspective of European actors. It requires consideration of the multiple societies, regions, and ecosystems that interacted with these voyages. Drake's routes passed through and impacted a wide range of geographic zones, each with its own historical trajectory. From this perspective, his voyages are not isolated events moving through empty space, but interactions within already populated and complex regions. This reframing further complicates simplified narratives of exploration. It shifts focus from discovery to interaction, from conquest to encounter, from singular achievement to multi-directional consequence. As we move toward the final section of this narrative, the emphasis shifts once again, not toward further expansion of analysis, but toward consolidation of understanding. Because after extensive examination of systems, contexts, and interpretations, what remains is a historical figure whose significance lies not in simplicity, but in layered complexity. And it is within that complexity that the final perspective begins to take shape. When Francis Drake is viewed through the full span of historical analysis, operational, political, economic, environmental, and cultural, what emerges is not a single narrative arc, but a convergence of multiple historical processes occurring at once. He was a participant in a world where boundaries between categories we now consider distinct were still fluid. Exploration was inseparable from conflict. Trade was inseparable from state competition. Navigation was inseparable from intelligence gathering. Private enterprise was inseparable from political authorization. In that environment, individuals like Drake operated as adaptable agents within overlapping systems rather than as specialists within clearly separated institutions. This structural fluidity is one of the defining features of early modern maritime history. It is also one of the reasons why figures from this period resist simple categorization in modern discourse. From an analytical standpoint, Drake's career can be understood as a sequence of engagements within three broad domains. First, maritime mobility systems. These include navigation routes, ship design capabilities, wind pattern exploitation, and logistical planning for long-duration voyages. His circumnavigation is the most prominent example, but it is part of a broader set of navigational practices evolving during the period. Second, imperial competition systems. This includes conflict between European powers over territorial claims, shipping rights, and access to colonial resources. Drake's raids on Spanish holdings must be interpreted within this context of sustained geopolitical rivalry. Third, economic extraction systems. These include the movement of goods, wealth, and commodities across oceanic networks, as well as the financial structures that supported long-distance maritime operations. Drake's activities intersected all three systems simultaneously. This intersection is what gives his career its historical density. However, it is also what makes interpretation difficult, because each system carries its own analytical framework and evaluative perspective. A purely military analysis emphasizes naval engagements and strategic outcomes. An economic analysis emphasizes wealth transfer and disruption of trade flows. A navigational analysis emphasizes geographic knowledge and route development. A cultural analysis emphasizes memory, identity, and symbolic representation. None of these perspectives is sufficient on its own. Together, they form a composite understanding. Another important aspect of Drake's historical position is temporal. He operated during a period of acceleration in global connectivity. The late 16th century was not yet a fully globalized world in the modern sense, but it was moving toward increased intercontinental integration through maritime expansion. This created conditions in which local actions could have distant consequences more rapidly and more frequently than in earlier historical periods. Drake's voyages illustrate this dynamic clearly. A single expedition could simultaneously affect European diplomatic relations, disrupt transatlantic trade networks, alter regional power balances in the Caribbean or Pacific, influence financial outcomes for investors in England, reshape navigational knowledge across multiple maritime routes. This multi-layered impact is characteristic of early globalization processes. Yet even within this expanding system, uncertainty remained dominant. Outcomes were not predictable in advance. Storms, disease, resistance, and logistical failures could alter the course of any expedition. Drake's career reflects this balance between expanding capability and persistent unpredictability. He achieved remarkable outcomes, but always within a framework of risk that could not be fully controlled. This tension is central to understanding early modern maritime history more broadly. Another dimension of final synthesis involves historical memory. Over time, Drake's life has been repeatedly recontextualized to serve different explanatory purposes. As a symbol of national resilience in England, as a figure of maritime aggression in Spanish and colonial memory, as a case study in early modern privateering systems in academic history, as a reference point in discussions of early globalization. These multiple identities coexist without fully resolving into a single narrative. This is not a failure of historical understanding. It is a reflection of the complexity of the subject matter. Historical figures who operate at the intersection of major systemic transformations tend to generate layered and sometimes contradictory interpretations. Drake is one such figure. As we approach the final portion of this narrative sequence, the focus shifts away from classification and toward recognition. Recognition that historical meaning is not fixed at the moment of action. It accumulates over time. It is shaped by later observers as much as by original events. And it remains open to reinterpretation as new frameworks emerge. In that sense, Francis Drake's story does not conclude in 1596. It continues in the way his life is studied, debated, and situated within broader histories of maritime expansion. Not as a single answer, but as an ongoing conversation between past events and present understanding. And in that conversation, his name persists, not as closure, but as continuity. Not as closure, but as continuity. At this stage of the narrative, Francis Drake is no longer being examined only as a historical actor, but as a point of convergence where multiple interpretive traditions meet. The details of his voyages, conflicts, and navigational achievements remain important, but their significance now lies in how they are positioned within broader historical reasoning. One of the most consistent conclusions across modern historical analysis is that Drake's career cannot be reduced to a single explanatory category. Attempts to define him solely as an explorer, or solely as a privateer, or solely as a naval commander, inevitably omit essential dimensions of his activities. Instead, his life is best understood through layered classification. At the operational level, he was a seafarer navigating extreme environmental and logistical challenges. At the strategic level, he was an agent operating within Anglo-Spanish rivalry and broader European maritime competition. At the economic level, he was involved in systems of extraction, redistribution, and disruption of established trade routes. At the institutional level, he was partially embedded within state authorization frameworks that blurred public and private authority. At the symbolic level, he became a constructed figure within national memory traditions that extended far beyond his lifetime. These layers do not cancel each other out. They coexist, sometimes reinforcing and sometimes contradicting one another. This is one of the central lessons of studying figures like Drake. Historical identity is not singular, but composite. Another key insight involves scale differentiation. Modern analysis distinguishes between three scales at which Drake's impact can be evaluated. Microscale, individual voyages, decisions, and engagements. Mesoscale, interactions between English, Spanish, and other maritime systems during the late 16th century. Macroscale, the gradual emergence of global maritime connectivity and early modern imperial structures. Drake's most visible achievements often appear at the microscale, but their significance is most fully understood at the meso and macro scales. For example, a single raid on a Spanish port may appear tactically limited in isolation. But when situated within broader patterns of repeated disruption, intelligence gathering, and maritime pressure, it contributes to cumulative strategic effects. Similarly, a circumnavigation is not merely a navigational achievement. It becomes part of a larger expansion of geographic knowledge systems and maritime capability. This multiscalar approach is essential for avoiding over-personalized interpretations of historical change. It prevents the assumption that complex global transformations can be attributed primarily to individual agency. At the same time, it does not eliminate agency. Instead, it locates agency within constraint. Drake made decisions, but those decisions were shaped by wind and ocean systems, technological limits of navigation, political authorization structures, economic incentives and risk calculations, military opposition and intelligence conditions. Understanding his career, therefore, requires integrating human action with structural constraint in a continuous analytical framework. Another important aspect of final synthesis is historiographical evolution. Over time, interpretations of Drake have shifted through several major phases. Initial commemorative phase, emphasis on national achievement and heroic narrative. Imperial phase, integration into broader narratives of maritime expansion and state power. Critical revision phase, increased attention to colonial impact, violence, and economic extraction systems. Comparative analytical phase, placement within global maritime systems alongside other European and non-European actors. Each phase does not replace the previous one entirely. Instead, they accumulate, creating a layered interpretive landscape. Modern scholarship often operates across all these layers simultaneously. This produces a more nuanced, but also more complex understanding of historical figures like Drake. It requires holding multiple perspectives in tension rather than resolving them into a single evaluative judgment. That tension is not a problem to be eliminated. It is a feature of mature historical analysis. As we move toward the final transition into closure, it is important to recognize what has been consistently present throughout Drake's story. Movement. Not only physical movement across oceans, but also movement of meaning across time. His life moved through geographical space, political systems, economic networks, cultural memory structures, historiographical frameworks. Each of these layers continues to evolve independently, which is why his story remains active in historical discourse. Not because new events are occurring in his life, but because new interpretations continue to emerge around it. In that sense, Drake's historical presence is not static. It is continuously reassembled. And it is this ongoing reconstruction that leads directly into the final perspective of the narrative. A perspective not focused on action but on reflection, not on movement but on pause. The final framing is not about concluding what Drake was. It is about understanding what his story has become. It is about understanding what his story has become. When all layers are brought together, voyage records, military engagements, economic disruption, navigational achievement, imperial rivalry, and later historical interpretation, Francis Drake's life settles into a final, composite form that resists simplification. He is not a single narrative line. He is a convergence point, a figure where early modern maritime history, emerging global systems, and evolving cultural memory intersect. The sea that carried him across continents is not just a setting for his biography, it is the structure that made his life possible. In the 16th century, oceans were simultaneously highways and frontiers, spaces of opportunity and danger, governed by wind patterns, seasonal timing, and fragile human coordination. Drake's voyages operated within that structure with unusual effectiveness, but never outside it. Every achievement remained dependent on conditions he did not control. Every success carried the possibility of reversal. This balance between agency and constraint defines much of his historical significance. In the end, what remains most stable across centuries of interpretation is not agreement about his character, but agreement about his impact. He participated in shaping the early phase of sustained European global maritime activity. He contributed to the disruption and reconfiguration of Spanish Atlantic systems. He demonstrated the operational possibility of English long-distance naval capability. And he became, after his death, a symbolic reference point through which later societies interpreted empire, exploration, and maritime power. Yet even these statements are not fixed in meaning. They are continually reread through changing historical lenses. That is why Drake persists in historical discussion, not because his story is closed, but because it remains open to perspective. As this narrative reaches its final moment, it returns to the same medium that defined his life, the ocean, unmapped in full detail, constantly in motion, shaped by forces larger than any single vessel. Drake's coffin was committed to those waters, and in a purely physical sense, his journey ended there. But historically, his movement did not stop. It continued in maps, in archives, in national memory, and in scholarly debate. And in that continuing movement, his life becomes something more than biography. It becomes a lens, a way of seeing how early modern worlds were built through navigation, conflict, exchange, and interpretation. So, as the account quiets, the final instruction is simple, not as performance, but as reflection. Take a slow breath. Let the noise of voyages, battles, and distant shores settle. Imagine the open sea at night, steady and wide, carrying the memory of countless ships across time. And recognize that history, like that sea, does not truly end. It only changes shape.